Test one. Test microphone test checking. 1, 2, 3.
This hearing of the Committee on Agriculture to review the state of the rural economy will come to order. By, I think, a gentleman's agreement, the ranking member and I are foregoing opening statements in the spirit of allowing as much time for the Secretary and who has a scheduled conflict later this morning and the other members. And I would also note that we would request that other members submit their opening statements for the record so the witnesses may begin their testimony and ensure there's ample time for questions. With that, I would like to welcome our witness to the table, the Honorable Tom Vilsack, Secretary, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington, D.C. Secretary Vilsack, please begin when you are ready, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and to the members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to appear before you this morning. I will just take a few minutes to briefly review where we are relative to farm income and the rural economy, and then I know that there are an opportunity for a number of questions on issues of concern to all of you. Last year we experienced a record farm income, and this year we are anticipating farm income will be above average, roughly $8 billion above the 10-year average. This is in part a result of record exports. We had a record year last year in agricultural exports. The first quarter of this year actually has surpassed the first quarter of last year by roughly 8%. So we expect and anticipate, again, strong exports, records in beef, poultry, and pork, as well as a 40% increase in volume in some of the bulk commodities that are now being traded. A record enrollment in conservation activities, nearly 500,000 producers being benefited from the conservation programs established by Congress, and a record expansion of local and regional markets gives opportunities for small and mid-sized operators to succeed. Debt-to-asset ratios and debt-to-equity ratios are the lowest they've been since 1954. There are concerns, obviously, and I'm sure we'll address many of them, but concerns that we are focused on at USDA is the lack of predictability in workforce and the need for comprehensive immigration reform, the impact of weather, specifically drought in the western part of the United States, and based on the recent agricultural census, continued concern about the declining middle within agriculture and the aging nature of farmers. The rural economy, despite agriculture's record income, still continues to have its challenges with persistent poverty, with stagnant job growth, and with population loss for the first time in quite some time. I think the Farm Bill that you all worked so extensively on, and we thank you for the work in getting it passed, provides real hope for a brighter and better future in rural America. It not only provides a strong safety net for our producers and expanding market opportunities both domestically and foreign, there will be a creative use of our conservation programs that will open up new income opportunities for producers, and it lays the cornerstones for a new natural resource economy with production agriculture and exports, local and regional food system expansion, conservation and its opportunity to expand outdoor recreation and ecosystem market opportunities, and the new opportunity to bring manufacturing back to rural America through the bio-based product manufacturing sections of the Farm Bill that will expand beyond fuel and energy to now include chemicals, polymers, and other fabrics. We are committed at USDA to a timely and transparent implementation of the Farm Bill that you passed. At your desks, I believe there is a report that we issued today indicating the steps that have already been taken in terms of implementation. We are significantly ahead of where we were in implementing the 2008 Farm Bill. I would say we are absolutely on track to have the livestock disaster assistance programs up and going so producers can apply on April 15th, and hopefully will receive resources shortly thereafter. Our focus in the spring and summer will be on getting the educational materials out about the new safety net programs, ensuring that we work diligently on the establishment of the regional conservation partnership effort outlined in the Farm Bill, and also establishing the Agricultural Foundation, which offers great hope and opportunities for us to leverage existing agricultural research dollars. Mr. Chairman, look forward to the questions from the committee, and again appreciate the opportunity to be here, as well as again appreciate the good work of this committee in getting the Farm Bill passed.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The Chair would like to remind members that they will be recognized for questioning in the order of seniority for members who were here at the start of the hearing. After that, members will be recognized in order of arrival, and I do appreciate the members' understanding, and with that, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Secretary, I'd be remiss if I didn't note how greatly I appreciate the heavy lift that you have now in front of you in implementing the Farm Bill. And we certainly felt that weight on this side of the room in the process of getting it to your desk. And I also appreciate greatly the efforts of you and your team during the Farm Bill process generally, especially in those final days of negotiations. And you know what I speak of, but thank you for making that happen. Could you take a little more time and provide more of an overall view of the implementation efforts as they've occurred so far and how you see them working through the rest of the summer and the fall? And if there are difficulties that you're encountering that would be appropriate to share with us, so perhaps we can help address those, I'd be interested in that too, Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Chairman, we actually began preparing for the passage of the Farm Bill before the bill was actually passed and signed by the President. We established individual committees within each title of the Farm Bill and asked them to identify the steps that would have to be taken in order to implement it fully, whether it would be a rule, guidance, policy directive, a notice in the Federal Registry, whatever it would be. We identified roughly 450 additional steps, significant steps that would have to be taken within the overall Farm Bill. We have a convening group that has reprioritized the priorities within each title to determine what needs to be done immediately. Obviously, our focus was on getting the disaster assistance programs up and going. We recognize that we have an equal set of pressure and stress on making sure that there's educational materials prepared and given to producers so that they can begin the process of understanding the various elections that they have to make, both in crop insurance and in the safety net programs. We want these producers to be prepared to make those decisions in an informed way sometime in the fall, late fall, early winter of this year so that they're in good shape for the 2015 crop year. So we anticipate livestock applications on or before April 15th, resources provided thereafter, shortly thereafter. Educational materials, we're in the process now of deciding how to allocate the $3 million that you all provided to establish the educational outreach and the $3 million that will create the education tools that will be used by folks to make decisions. We also understand the significance of what you've done in conservation, and we know there's great interest in these regional partnerships, so we are obviously focused on making sure that we get those in order in a relatively quick way. We are in the process right now of making conservation programs available. EQIP, CSP, there are sign-up opportunities at this point in time, and we anticipate obligations being completed on the regular programs sometime this summer. In terms of the foundation, we have a number of steps legally that we have to take, which we expect and anticipate taking very, very shortly. There will be a meeting of the ex officio board members, the interim board. We will, this week, have provided a notice to the world to submit applications and nominations for folks who can serve on the board. We'll vet those folks, and hopefully sometime late spring we will be in a position to have a full board appointed. We expect and anticipate a lot of activity in 2014. And at this point in time, we think we have what we need, but we appreciate the offer that if we are in need of assistance, we'll certainly let you know.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back and turn to the ranking member and recognize him for 5 minutes for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, appreciate you being here. And apparently you guys have decided not to do a general sign-up in CRP in 2014 or until the fall, I guess. Or is that the decision?
Representative Peterson, I'm not sure that decision has been final. As you well know, the amount of acreage available in CRP has been somewhat contained and restricted by congressional action. So we're in the process of taking a look at precisely where we are relative to continuous sign-up, which obviously continues. What I do know about CRP is that because of the limitations in the future, we're going to have to be quite targeted and quite focused. We think we have some flexibility in the continuous programs, but at this point I wouldn't say that we've finally made a decision relative to a general sign-up.
Well, I would encourage you to take a look at it. I think there's, from what I can tell, there's 1.5 million, 2 million acres left in there, even with the 24 million cap. So I'm concerned that, given what's going on with commodity prices and so forth, I think things are going to change. I mean, we've been having people tearing up their CRP because of the high rents and so forth, but I think that may change. So I would, and the continuous is not going to solve all the problems that I'm interested in. We need big track CRP to maintain these wildlife populations. That's what has brought back pheasants and deer and some of this other stuff. And so the continuous is, by itself isn't going to get it in terms of wildlife, in my opinion.
I don't disagree, and as you know, we've had a number of general sign-ups since I've been secretary.
Well, thank you. And I would just encourage, because if you wait till fall, we're going to miss the year here, and up in our part of the country. The way winter is going, we may not, we may have snow in July, but. I was reading in the story someplace the last couple of days about the bee pollinator situation, and it was reported that there's apparently some kind of federal program or something to encourage people to plant alfalfa and clover. Do you know what they're talking about?
We provided $3 million to encourage better habitat for pollinators, given the challenges and concerns we've seen.
How does that work? How is the $3 million? What does it do?
Well, it's essentially focused on the upper Midwest area in an effort to try to see whether or not incentives will work to encourage the planting of grasses, et cetera, that will be attractive to pollinators. And it is part of an overall effort that involves the establishment of a pollinator working group at USDA. And it is something that the White House is also quite interested in. The science, John Holdren is involved in this as well. And we are doing additional research in terms of trying to establish precisely what the threats are, what the challenges are for pollinators. It's complicated, and it's not doesn't lend itself to a simple answer.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, and we appreciate your efforts. But I guess, is it like a cost share? Is that what you're looking at? So if you're going to plant, say if you've got some land that's in general crops, corn or soybeans, and you're going to put it down into alfalfa and clover, how would would it be like a cost share that?
Well, I think it helps to defray the expense if you make that decision.
To plant it?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. So it'd be like the cost share that you get for planting CRP or some of these other things.
Yes, sir.
Okay. On the dairy front, I know you're moving rapidly on that. One provision in the bill was to allow California to come into the federal order system, and I understand there's been meetings with California processors and so forth. So can you kind of update me on, or do you know where that's at and how that's progressing?
There have been 3 or 4 specific trips by our AMS personnel to California. I think we've probably addressed nearly 80% of the producers, manufacturers, and trade organizations, as well as the California Department of Food and Agriculture. We would expect and anticipate that the formal proposal that is required to trigger this will be submitted sometime this spring. Once that industry submits a proposal, we may have to go through, as you know, 1 or more formal rulemaking hearings, and then obviously there's got to be a approval by the producers. So the process is moving, and we are prepared to cooperate should the producers want to be part of this. We basically have 10 of these, representing roughly 60% of the dairy industry in the country today.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Nogebauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, thank you for being here. Just a couple of things. I guess one of the things that wasn't really resolved in the Farm Bill was the actively engaged rules, and that was left up to your agency to determine. And obviously, a lot of the producers in my district are very interested in this process. Can you elaborate a little bit of kind of how you see this process being developed and what kind of input that you might seek from producers and producer groups?
This is obviously an issue that raised a lot of concerns and interest, as you indicated. I would say first and foremost, we are dealing in a very narrow band in terms of what Congress has directed us to do. As you well know, there is a family farm provision as it relates to the actively engaged, which will probably address a large percentage of operations in the United States, so that obviously won't be part of our review or conversation. It will be primarily focused on general and limited partnerships. It is not likely to be focused to a great extent on corporate structures because of the nature of liabilities. So we will be looking at the universe of folks that we are dealing with. We will propose an interim rule process so that folks will be given the opportunity to weigh in, to have comment, to express concerns. This is a very difficult issue to provide the kind of clarity and certainty that I think everybody would like to have. But we are working on it. I had a meeting just yesterday with my staff on this. So we understand our role, we understand the narrow focus, we understand where the attention needs to be placed, and we understand the process has to be transparent and has to give people an opportunity to weigh in and comment on whatever we ultimately decide.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The other thing is, recently Fish and Wildlife last week listed the prairie chicken as threatened. I'm on the record saying that I don't believe that was necessary. But one of the things I do understand is that supposedly Fish and Wildlife did consult with USDA about this issue. And what I was wondering is, did they ask or did you furnish them any information that would lead them to have information of the economic impact of listing this species and the hardship or burden that it might place on producers?
Congressman, our primary conversations with Fish and Wildlife Service on this particular issue was how we might be able to provide the same kind of regulatory certainty for lesser prairie chicken that we have provided for sage grouse. So we have been able to enter into an arrangement with Fish and Wildlife for the benefit of landowners and producers in which we lay out specific conservation practices that if farmers pursuant to NRCS, working with NRCS, adopt these conservation practices, then they don't have to worry about incidental takings relative to conservation practices or relative to their operation. This will for a period of 30 years. So our focus has been primarily on trying to figure out ways in which we can mitigate the impact on farming operations. I'll have to check with my staff as to whether or not economic information was provided, but I know that I did direct the staff to look at ways in which we could create more regulatory certainty for folks who may be impacted by this decision.
Thank you. I would appreciate it if you would follow up about the economic, which kind of leads me to the next question on cool. One of the things that I think was a part of the Farm Bill was that I think within 180 days of enactment that the agency would furnish a study of the economic impact on cool, and I can tell you firsthand it's had an economic impact on my district, and it hasn't been in a positive way. For example, they closed a packing plant, Cargill did, in Plainview, Texas, cost 2,000 jobs. And when you talk to local leaders and leaders at Cargill, they will tell you that the cool regulations had, a substantial part to do with that. And so I'm very anxious to hear, your progress and kind of see how you think that's playing out and when can we expect that report?
Well, the report will be furnished in a timely way. We obviously are in a situation where Congress has directed us pursuant to statute to establish a labeling responsibility. The WTO has given us direction and guidance as to what those labels require. We're obviously in a current litigated situation, if you want to call it that, with Canada and Mexico. We anticipate and expect some indication of what the WTO panel is considering sometime in the June and July time period of this year.
One last question. With the new Farm Bill and a fairly different Farm Bill, a new safety net, a lot of different moving parts, a lot of choices, which is a good thing. One of the things that concern me a little bit is in the President's budget. We're seeing that proposing closing more FSA offices, and I'm wondering about, in a time where we need to be educating our producers, new programs, new procedures, does that make sense?
Well, first of all, Congressman, we are not anticipating and expecting the closure of any offices in 2014. So the current state and system will stay in place. However, FSA's budget in terms of salaries and expenses has resulted in a 20% reduction in workforce over the last several years. Technology is going to change the way in which work is being done at FSA offices. We know that we have roughly 130 to 140 offices that either have no full-time employee working at them or have a single full-time employee working at them. We believe that there is an opportunity for us to take this year and look at where the work actually is being done and essentially reorganize and restructure the FSA system so that the people are where the work is, and create basically a three-tiered system with central offices with supervisory personnel and more than 3 employees, branch offices with 3 employees but no supervisory personnel, satellite offices where people will be able to obtain by appointment an opportunity to meet face-to-face. With the technology changes, we're hopeful that within the next year to 2, many of our producers won't even actually have to access an FSA office, but if they do, they'll be able to access all of their records in all of the counties where they may have land in a single office. That's going to change significantly the way in which FSA offices operate. Our view is that there's a new opportunity for FSA offices to be a one-stop shop for information about not just their own programs, but all the other programs that may tangentially impact and affect a farming operation and provide additional income opportunities. We want them to be a greater guide and greater counselor to producers. So we're taking a look at how we might be able to modernize the system, but for 2014, we don't anticipate any significant change.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina for 5 minutes. Mr. McIntyre.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your strong work on behalf of agriculture and your very good work for rural economic development. Following up on the last question, we too are hearing from farmers about the FSA field offices being understaffed, and with the new regulations in place, and you were just talking about a 3-tiered system and the concern of about a 20% reduction in workforce, what kind of timetable for this year with the change in obviously with the Farm Bill, are you looking at and being able to have adequate staffing to be able to meet these needs as farmers come in with questions?
The Farm Bill provided $100 million of additional resources, and we are using those resources now to begin the process of ramping up temporary help at many of these offices. I emphasize temporary because we clearly don't have the permanent budget capacity to support additional permanent help. I would point out that when and if there is consolidation of offices in 2015, that it is not about saving money, it's really about redirecting those resources to strengthen the remaining offices that will be in existence. We have over 2,100 offices today, and so there shouldn't be any change this year. We are ramping up temporary help to provide assistance and help as we implement the Farm Bill. So I don't think there needs to be as much concern as there might be if one understands precisely what we're doing relative to the FSA offices. No impact on 2014, temporary help in 2014.
Thank you. And you mentioned about the next year or two, you were just saying a moment ago to your answer to my colleague about technology improvements. With regard to updated software so that those FSA temporary employees and permanent employees can do their job, how soon do you expect that updated software so that they'll be able to implement what needs to be done to help the farmers with the new Farm Bill?
Well, we are in a position, we believe, to be able to provide producers information that would allow them to take a look at their operations sometime late summer, early fall, make adjustments to their production history, and then provide additional information over the fall so that when they have to make the election in the latter part of this year, whether it's ARC or PLC, whether they opt for supplemental coverage under the crop insurance opportunities or not, that they'll have adequate and sufficient information to be able to make that informed decision. So we're going to have everything in place during the summer and the fall so folks can access information, so that conferences can be held, so that land-grant universities and extension, the minority-serving institutions will be able to provide information to folks who have questions. And so that's our plan.
Thank you. And in addition to talking about by this fall, in earlier testimony today to the chairman, you said that late fall, early winter, you mentioned. Is that the ultimate goal for full implementation of all aspects of the Farm Bill?
I wouldn't say that that's a fair statement, Representative. I think that there are issues that will bleed into 2015. What we've attempted to do is to try to establish the highest priority areas, the things that people have the greatest concerns about and the need to get done this year, and that's where we're focused on. We think if we get the dairy program up and going as we're required to do, if we have the stacks and the supplemental crop insurance option available, if we have the ARC and PLC programs in place and the disaster assistance and the conservation process in place, that we will have gone a long way. But there are still issues relative to crop insurance changes that may take a little bit longer than that. the conservation compliance issue, for example. That may bleed into 2015, and the reason that's not as high a priority is because, in a sense, we already have that responsibility now. If you're participating in a disaster program or any other safety net program, you've got conservation responsibilities. So it will take a while. We'll be happy to show you the 450 additional steps that have to be taken. It's a complicated thing.
Thank you. And in my remaining few seconds, I want to thank you for your help with this final year of the tobacco buyout to honor the contract surrendered to a decade ago. What is the timeline for the transfers and successors of producers and quota holders to receive their final payment? When can those payments pending from last year and those due to a deceased holder expect to be made?
Well, we've paid out over 90% of the resources to producers in February. We expect and anticipate the remaining payments to be made sometime late spring.
Thank you, and thank you again for your help with that. I know how important that's been, and we appreciate your helping us to resolve that over the last 10 years, it being a project that has now come to fruition. With that, I yield back my time, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this hearing, and Mr. Secretary, I appreciate your service in coming here to testify this morning. Let's start with one that is, I think, going to be good news, and that is, do you have some information on the appreciation of the value of ag land, say, in the Corn Belt over the period of time that you've been Secretary and perhaps before?
Well, Congressman, I think the best way for me to put it would be to point out that our debt-to-asset and debt-to-equity ratios are the lowest they've been in since 1954. So obviously there's been appreciation of land. There's also been land acquisition, but not as it was in the 70s and 80s based on debt, but based on the capacity of people to pay cash for land. So I think we're in a very solid position at this point.
Much different than it was going into the 80s.
Very much
We're
so.
highly leveraged. I just wanted to make that point because I think we made a lot of progress in that situation. And then in the Farm Bill that has most recently become law, there were 3 provisions I would have liked to seen in it that would have treated livestock producers a lot better. And that's the GIPSA language of Mr. Conway's, which I won't go very far into, expecting he may. The other is the cool language, which you've spoken to, and it mentioned that we are in a current litigation situation regarding WTO agreements. Had that cool language, just for the record, had that cool language that was in our version of the bill, had that been gone into law, if we had made it either voluntary or repealed it, can you tell the committee where the litigation might be now?
Obviously, if it had been repealed, it may very well have rendered the current issue moot. I'm not sure that necessarily that a change in the law directing us to label in a particular way would have necessarily resolved the concerns of the Canadians and Mexicans. I just don't know.
But perhaps moot.
Moot if you repeal it, because then there's not an issue here, other than they might contend that they have been damaged in some way, and frankly, we are a bit skeptical of those damage claims.
And I think that is it's my position to repeal it, and I think it is the position of this committee, and as one of my disappointments out of the Farm Bill. Then I'd like to go to the RFS and ask you, have you been asked to consult on the EPA's reconsideration of the renewable fuel standard?
Well, we have a responsibility, I think, to always indicate to EPA our views on the renewable fuel standard, and we have done that. What I have attempted to do is to focus on the areas that I have specific control over, and that is the ability to potentially look for additional market opportunities overseas. We think there is an export opportunity that needs to be explored, and with the blessing of corn growers and others in the industry, we're going to expand our trade mission to China to include representatives from the biofuel industry. We also are continuing to look at ways in which we can use the resources we have, notwithstanding the restrictions that are in the Farm Bill on the REAP program, to see if there are ways in which we might be able to encourage more distribution of higher blends.
I appreciate those extra opportunities out there, but as far as advice to EPA as you consult with them on the basis of the law on the renewable fuel standard, as you look at that language, what's your recommendation to them as they reconsider?
Well, I'd say a couple things, Congressman. I mean, first of all, I am a strong believer in the renewable fuel standard, and I know it's controversial even in this committee, but I believe it is important to have for jobs, for stabilizing farm income, for reducing our reliance on oil, foreign oil, and for providing consumers choice and less expensive gas. So
but with regard to the language in the Act itself.
So I think we need it. I think that the EPA has a very interesting situation where the basis of that standard was established on the belief that we would, as a country, continue to use more and more gasoline with more fuel-efficient vehicles and with a difficult economy at times. That has not been the case. But since the EPA rendered its initial projections, gasoline use has increased, and we wanted to make sure that EPA was aware of that because we think that could have an impact on what they ultimately decide.
Well, let me then just borrow a little bit of our time and make my recommendation to the EPA then, and that is that they review the data with current numbers rather than 2011 numbers and go back and carefully read the law and the directive that Congress delivered on that. And I'd like to then just stop quickly at one more piece here, and that is the amendment that I had called the Protect Interstate Commerce Amendment. And you predicted that if it stayed in the bill that there would be a lot of litigation because the amendment is not well drafted. I don't find other lawyers that read that way, but I'd ask if you could briefly comment on what do you think the impact will be on the egg supply, especially in California, if the people who do litigate and have started now, originating in Missouri, are not successful.
Gentleman's time expired, but the witness may answer the question.
Well, Congressman, I honestly, you and I obviously have a disagreement about the clarity of the provision. I think it would have led to a lot of confusion. I think, frankly, we're going to have to see what courts ultimately decide on this issue to provide clarity. It may have an impact. It could be a positive impact in some producing areas. It may have a negative impact in other producing areas. I think it's, the market ultimately is going to decide, and the market's going to decide how many eggs we consume. Let me just, if I could, Mr. Chairman, 30 seconds on the RFS. This needs to be perhaps noted in this committee's history. Congressman, you and I agree. So mark that down. I think they should look at the current gas usage, and I think they obviously need to read the law very, very carefully.
And I would note to both of you, I'm very sensitive about the renewable fuel standard. Gentleman's time's expired.
I do acknowledge the Secretary's statement, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. David Scott's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, given Congress's clear intent to limit the federal jurisdiction of navigable waters, and also given the Supreme Court's interpretation the same way to limit navigational waters, how do you justify the EPA's proposed rule to extend, not limit, but to extend federal jurisdiction so much beyond navigable waters, that flies directly in the face of what Congress intended and directly in the face of what the Supreme Court interpreted?
Congressman, this is a law that Congress wrote. It's a law that the Supreme Court has interpreted, and it is a law that the EPA has responsibility for implementation. My role, I believe, is to make sure that EPA is fully aware of the potential impact that it could have on farming and ranching and land ownership as it relates to rural lands, and we have done that. My role is to make sure that there is greater clarity in terms of what this rule does and does not do. And I think by virtue of our input, we have clarified and reaffirmed that normal, traditional agricultural activities not impacted. We have reaffirmed that agricultural stormwater discharges not impacted. We have reaffirmed the maintenance of drainage ditches are exempt. We have also cleared up that groundwater, tile drains, the regulation of ditches are not going to be expanded. In fact, I think we have now clarity in terms of precisely what is involved here. It doesn't involve wastewater treatment systems. It doesn't involve artificial lakes or ponds for rice. And we went one step further in pointing out to the EPA that when people do conservation practices, it is really about improving water quality, which is why they have identified 56 specific areas that will not require permitting. So I think our responsibility is to do what we did, which is to provide clarity and certainty.
Well, Mr. Secretary, I do hope that you will be able to do more, because we need a strong advocate. Our farmers are struggling with this issue. They cannot run their farms in an efficient way, not knowing from one day or next what interpretation is of navigable waters. Sometimes it could be even like a puddle. I mean, when you have that kind of discrepancy, our farmers are faced with so many obstacles that I just urge you to do that. But let me ask you, is it true that farmers only qualify for a Clean Water Act Section 404 exemption if the farmer follows the NRCS standards?
We have worked with the EPA to ensure that when folks follow the rules that are established by NRCS in concert with the landowner as they put together the conservation plan and as they decide what needs to be done, that if they follow through and it's in one of those 56 activities, that they don't have to worry about getting a permit or notifying anyone.
Okay.
There's an ongoing conversation that will take place as a result of an MOU so that as further information is forthcoming or issues arise that would fall into this bucket, that number may be 58, maybe 63, maybe 75 a year from now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. And I just urge you to help our farmers as much as you can on that. I get a lot of complaints from our farmers in Georgia about the navigable waters issue. But there are two other points, and my time is running out, but I think that are facing really the greatest challenges facing agriculture and farming now. One of them is the age of our farmers is getting higher and higher and higher. The average age of our farmers now are almost 60 years. I think that this is a great threat to the future of agriculture. And we need to do more to get our younger people engaged in farming. Next month, I'm going to give the commencement address at the University of Georgia School of Agriculture. And I want to say something to these students and give them some hope on that. And I'd like for you to tell me what the USDA is doing to help to bring down the barriers. I mean, it's one thing to say to a young person, go into business selling shoes. You just open up a store, get on the corner and do that. But when you're talking about going into farming in this day's climate, there's land acquisition. There's a lot of things there. One of the things that I want to propose is that we look at how we can give students loan forgiveness, scholarships. Perhaps we can use the combination of the 1860s and 1890s to work collaboratively together, change the language and the law so that we can give students scholarships and so that we can maybe give loan forgiveness. Because if we don't do something to get some incentives for our young people to get into farming and bring that age down, the future of this nation and quite honestly the world is at stake. As the world grows, farmers are getting older. We got to face this dilemma. Could you?
Gentleman's time has expired, but the witness may answer the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congressman, there are a number of steps that we are taking and will be taking. Increased resources in the Beginning Farmer and Developer Ranch program, the establishment of the microloan program, which this Congress has now increased the limit, new opportunities in terms of less expensive crop insurance for beginning farmers, which they didn't have before. The ability to get advance payments on conservation for beginning farmers, a more flexible definition of beginning farmer, lower credit costs for beginning farmers, additional premium assistance in terms of crop insurance for beginning farmers. And we are also working with a program called AGREE to take a look at ways in which we could potentially create a food corps which would be similar to the Peace Corps, which is or VISTA or AmeriCorps, which is akin to your idea. It wasn't so much a scholarship as it would be the capacity to pay for someone to be mentored on a farm. With the CRP transition program, there may be ways in which we can get young people involved. And I think the fact that we've expanded local and regional food system market opportunities allows smaller operators and producers access to farming, which is why we've seen a slight increase in people farming under the age of 35. So the trend line, you're correct, we got a challenge, but I think we're beginning to see a little brighter future in that respect.
Thank you. Thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that.
Gentleman's time has expired. Recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I want to thank in advance all those hardworking FSA, NRCS folks across this country are going to be implementing the Farm Bill. Once the base decisions are made here in D.C., they've got a great team in place. So they're challenged, and they've got a lot of hard work ahead of them to communicate these changes to the folks. So please express our appreciation for what they're currently doing or about to do in regard. Talk about cotton a little bit. China has, by some reports, a 57 million barrel strategic reserve, something in the order of 4 to 5 times U.S. production. We're not real sure what they're going to do with it and why, and it's got a big overhang on the market that's having some impact. Can you talk to us about what you and the USDA has done to communicate to either directly to the Chinese or to the WTO our concerns about what they might or might not be doing with respect to their cotton policy and the high subsidies they're paying?
Congressman, I appreciate you bringing this issue to bringing it up. In our conversations with China in the last several years have been focused primarily on their regulatory system and process and trying to get it better synchronized with ours in terms of regulatory approvals. If I can ask for your permission, I'd be happy to get you a more detailed conversation on what the communications have been relative to cotton in China. I can tell you that we have established a China-American business group in China, the purpose of which is to allow us to not only inform the Chinese through official circles, but also to engage Chinese officials and Chinese business leaders in these conversations. But let me get you more information on cotton.
Well, I appreciate that. Please include in there, there's some indication that in 2014 they're going to make some changes to whatever their policy is or has been. So fold in what their prospects of what they're going to do is as a part of that conversation, and I appreciate you getting back to us on that. Let's talk a little bit about the SNAP program and the able-bodied adults under the age of 50 with no dependents. Now that unemployment nationwide has come down to something 6.7%, can you talk to us a bit about what your plans are to continue granting waivers to states who have asked for those waivers for folks in that category to stay on food stamps beyond the normal 3-month category?
You know, Congressman, I think there is a real opportunity in this area, and for that matter, the entire SNAP population, to do a better job of connecting work opportunities with folks on SNAP who are interested in working and who are capable of working. That's why we're excited about the portion of the Farm Bill that creates the opportunity for us to have up to 10 pilots with states to do a better job of connecting. And I think the fact that we have these pilots is going to send a strong message about the important work that states must do a better job of using the education and training money that they have to actually do a better job of getting folks better connected. We think there is a disconnect between economic development and workforce development offices at the state level and human services offices. These folks know where the jobs are. These folks know who's looking for a job. For whatever reason, they're not doing a particularly good job of talking. We provide several $100 million to encourage that kind of conversation. We need to do a better job of compelling that conversation. We'll be happy to take a look at the waiver issue. I think there are circumstances, unfortunately, in some states where the unemployment rate overall may be low, but there may be particular areas within that state where the unemployment rate is unacceptably high. And so there may be the need for some kind of flexibility as it relates to those areas.
So you're saying that you can target those waivers to specific counties versus the entire state?
Well, I think that there are opportunities to do that, and opportunities, again, to work with states to compel them to do a better job. We're seeing a plateauing and now a slight decline of the number of people in need of SNAP, which I think reflects the unemployment circumstance, but there's still work to be done here. And I am very focused on making sure these pilots actually give us information that will allow us to develop better policies in the future.
Well, I hope we can see if you'll communicate that with us, once you begin to see some results out of those pilots, that you'll share that with Congress as well as we deal with the 80% of the spending in the Farm Bill that's related to nutrition programs. So with that, I yield back. Now I recognize Mr. Costa.
Yes.
5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the Secretary for his good work and his staff. Speaking of which, I want to acknowledge that one of your staff members who's departing used to work for many of us here in the House Committee, and that's Ann McMillan, and we wish her the very best in her future endeavors, Mr. Secretary. Your opening statement talked about the good and the bad and the challenges American agriculture faces. On the plus notes, you noted that record profits due in large result to trade activity has been occurring throughout American agriculture. Have you done any evaluations, the Department, on what the benefits would be if the TTIP, the trade negotiations between ourselves and the Europeans and the TPA, were to be successfully negotiated?
Well, we are confident that it would substantially increase trade activities, Congressman. I can get you the specific dollar
I think that would be helpful.
But there's no question. That's why we're engaged in these conversations, because we realize that there is terrific opportunity for.
And your efforts with the most difficult non-trade barriers, non-tariff barriers, which are the phytosanitary standards, obviously would be appreciated as well.
Well, I can tell you that we've eliminated or knocked down roughly 1,500 of those barriers since I've been Secretary. The challenge with both of those negotiations, on the TTIP negotiation, it is all about Europe's willingness to understand the importance of biotechnology and Europe's willingness to understand that some of these geographic indicators that they are so insistent on have become so generic that it really is unfair.
Like Parmesan and Burgundy.
Right. I mean, it's just it's a challenge. It's a challenge, especially for the dairy industry, and it's one that we need to be talking more about so that folks understand what's at stake. On TTIP or on TPP, it's all about market access and the ability of the Japanese and Canadians to be more realistic about what kind of market access they're willing to provide.
Yeah, I want to switch over here because I don't have a lot of time. We also appreciate your visit to California. You mentioned the drought problems facing the West, and particularly California. And many of us represent the heart of the San Joaquin Valley, which is ground zero for the drought impacts that we're facing. You and the President's visit was appreciated, but I'm concerned about the follow-through. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to read for the record and submit it a letter that Bishop Ochoa provided for many of us, and I'll read excerpts of it. Dear President Obama, the lack of water is impacting everyone, farmers, ranchers, dairymen, their employees, faith communities, and the businesses that serve them. The situation is quickly deteriorating into humanitarian crisis. Businesses are shutting their doors and others are laying off employees. Access for children, families to clean, drinkable water is uncertain. Lines at food banks and human service agencies have doubled due to this issue, and in fact, our Catholic Charities services went from 87,000 units in 2012 to 137,000 units in 2013, and we believe this year the number will double. We are reminded that at this time of drought, our dependence on the Creator, but our human dignity relies on access to water. I'll submit the rest of that with unanimous consent.
Unanimous consent.
What can a rancher do in my district, Mr. Secretary? I know you only have a partial responsibility to save his 1,000-head herd, as he doesn't have feed available now. The livestock disaster programs are set to begin enrollments on April 15th. But what about today? Where are we? There was a commitment to provide additional financial support. I'm terribly worried about this.
Well, that producer has access to additional EQIP money that can be used for improvements to grazing or cropland or water utilization. That producer can also, if he's an organic producer, has a variance to the organic grazing requirements. That producer could take advantage of the conservation innovation grants that we are making available to create new and creative ways to deal and cope with less water.
Okay, why don't we follow up on that? I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary. How about the food banks that are going to face increased demands?
How about what?
Food banks.
Well, the food banks have received an additional $60 million of assistance that the President announced, and that resource has been available and it will continue to be available.
I have a list of other questions, but time doesn't allow me. I will submit them for the record, and Mr. Secretary can get back to me. Quickly on two other areas. Why would the administration be proposing dramatic cuts in self-help housing, the 502 direct mortgage programs that have been proven to work at a small cost to the government?
If you understand the budget of USDA, 50% of our budget is in four areas. It's in fire suppression. It's in
which we need.
It's in rental assistance, and it's in food safety. When sequester is established, when additional cuts are put on top of sequester, as has been the case for USDA, that 50% has actually seen increases. It means the other 50% get impacted. And so something has to give. And our challenge is obviously to make sure that we continue to provide a link to direct housing loans, to guaranteed loans, which we are attempting to do in record amounts. 800,000 folks have had home ownership since I've been secretary because of the work of USDA, but you got a situation here where part of the budget continually gets increased and the other part has to bear its burden and the other 50%'s burden of cuts.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll submit the rest of my questions to be responded to in a timely manner.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Secretary, would you remind the committee, I believe you have an obligation later this morning that you have to leave, what your departure time will be for our time purposes up here?
12:15, Mr. Chairman.
12:15. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I know my colleagues will work in an expedited fashion to give everyone an opportunity. With that, I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gibbs, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary, for coming in today. As you're aware, last week the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. EPA put out a rule supposedly to clarify the waters of the United States. And yesterday in my committee, Water Resources Subcommittee, T&I, we had Secretary Darcy, and during the hearing, I told her that for a rule that's supposed to come out for more clarification, it was more muddier. And if you look back at the 2006 Supreme Court decision, the Rapanos decision, that there's limits to the federal role of under the Clean Water Act, and they need to pull back. And she could not give any examples of where there would be some pullback. And I almost have to come to the conclusion that they currently view that they have all the authority they need now, and so that. I just want to make that message clear to you. But I know in your shop, we're dealing with the NRCS and Natural Resources Conservation Service. First question, currently, would you agree that under normal farming practices that agriculture is exempt from 404 permits under the Clean Water Act?
Yes.
Okay, so when they're talking about dredge and fill and all practices, and they're exempt. So in regard to Mr. Scott's questions, this rule would be an expansion of the federal government's role in the Clean Water Act, because currently, as you just agreed, that normal farming practices agriculture is exempt. It doesn't matter if they're working with NRCS or not, correct?
Well, I just want to make sure that I'm clear about this, Congressman. Normal farming activities, plowing, seeding, cultivating, drainage, harvesting for production, upland soil and water conservation practices, agricultural stormwater discharges, return flows from irrigated agriculture, the construction and maintenance of farm and stock ponds, maintenance of drainage ditches, all of that is currently exempt.
That's correct. But with your USDA's memorandum of understanding that you're developing with the US EPA, the way I've read it is that they have to be under NRCS standards.
No,
under the rule.
No, it's important for everyone to understand that normal agricultural activities are exempt, have been exempt, and continue to be exempt. In addition, they provided clarity that groundwater, tile drains, regulations of ditches, artificial lakes and ponds, this proposed rule is not designed to touch those. But in an effort to be quite clear about this, because the uncertainty was, well, what if I engage in certain conservation practices? We began the process of identifying specific conservation practices so there would be no misunderstanding and no confusion. If you're doing one of these 56 conservation practices, working with the NRCS, you don't have to worry about notifying anybody. You don't have to worry about getting a permit. The purpose of this is really to provide clarity and certainty for producers. It's not to provide, confusion.
So your belief is that the rule, nothing can come under 402 permits for agriculture, for pollution permits, for weed control activities, fertilizer application, and all that would be currently exempt. There would be no expansion.
If it's within normal farming activities, as I understand it, that's exempt.
Okay, because I've got really a lot of concerns, and I know the agriculture organizations out there, I've spoke to them all, are really concerned about, the definition, how they're doing this. And now Secretary Darcy said yesterday that, you know, significant nexus and case-by-case scenarios. And so, you know, the door's open for them to move forward. So we got to be really careful on the USDA's role and your role to make sure that normal farming practices, if they're not even partnering with NRCS, are still be exempt under all from all permits for the CWA.
Right, and that's why we established this MOU to have an ongoing, continuing conversation between the three of us, Corps, USDA, and EPA, so as issues come up in the field, they can be addressed and dealt with. That list of conservation practices may be expanded, and we may be able to provide greater certainty for the EPA as well.
So the producers out there that are working with NRCS and doing conservation practices, would it be NRCS that would do the inspection to make sure the practices are being followed, or the EPA and NRCS?
Yes.
Correct? Because that's a sticking point to concern.
NRCS.
Because we want to make sure that we've had good programs out in the countryside, especially with Soil and Water Conservation Service, to work in agriculture, doing the right thing, and that's a good partnership. We want to make sure that partnership goes on. So my time's expired. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Walls, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you and your staff for the work you've done. I also want to especially thank you for that visionary and strong-shouldered support of American clean energy and the RFS. I associate myself with my colleague from the Deep South, Mr. King, on his support of the RFS. Created great jobs out in Middle America. It's made us less dependent on foreign oil. It's visionary. We're moving forward, and after basically a decade, we have become so much more efficient. So don't change the goalposts now. Give our entrepreneurs the chance to succeed. I am also very proud of what we did in the energy title of this piece of legislation. As the ranking member on that subcommittee, we have $881 million in mandatory funding, key programs like REAP, Biorefining Assistance Program, BCAP, and BioPreferred. My question to you, Mr. Secretary, is how are you going to quickly translate those funds into real projects that create jobs and energy on the ground out there?
We would anticipate the ability to expand 9003 funding to chemical processing and manufacturing this year. We think that there may require a slight tweaking of our rules and regulations in order to expand it to polymers and some of the other fabrics and fibers that you all were considering. But we expect and anticipate to be able to hit the ground running on this immediately.
Great. Well, we're appreciative of it, and it's some exciting stuff happening out there. I also wanted to associate myself with Mr. Scott's comments that were very pointed, and I appreciate your response on that, this issue of beginning farmer and rancher. Mr. Fortenberry, myself, the chairman and the ranking member, put together, I think, a good package on that, but Mr. Scott's hitting on a real key issue of those barriers, of giving them the opportunity. It's not opportunity of outcomes. It's opportunity to get in the business and then let them go. So again, I stress anything we can do to move those programs forward and get our young folks on the land is critical. And one other association Mr. Costa brought up, and again, my friend from Iowa and my colleague to the west, Ms. Noem, and I, this issue of water is not isolated to California. And I've got one of our largest meatpacking plants in JBS Swift in Worthington can't expand because we don't have water. And it's not because we don't have a plan. We have a project. The states and the local communities have not only paid for it, they've paid ahead. Federal government's been promising them for the better part of the last decade and a half that we would get our obligation done. We have not done it, so you've got a half-built water project on Lewis and Clark Rural Water that is holding back economic growth. I've got citizens in 2014 in the United States catching rainwater in cisterns for drinking water, and the only reason it's not done, we're not more competitive, we're not creating more jobs, is because we're not fulfilling our promise. So I know this isn't directly your wheelhouse, but it's your folks, your producers, my friends and neighbors across the Midwest. This is a smart project that the longer we wait just costs more. So anything you can do, Mr. Secretary, to add your voice. This is wrong, and in all fairness, it's crossed several administrations who have been equally bad on it, and it's just not the right thing. So this water issue is critical. If you could add your voice, I'd be grateful. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate my colleague, Mr. Waltz, bringing up water. Absolutely critical for the western United States. Issue, Mr. Secretary, that we've had an opportunity to be able to visit on before. noting some of your comments when we're talking about some of the new EPA regulations that are coming forward, being able to create certainty for our farm and ranch community. We have no certainty in the West for our farm and ranch community when it comes to being able to protect a private property right, be it for our ski areas or for our farm and ranch communities as well. As you're well aware, through your department, they put forward rules that were struck down by the court because the department did not follow its own rules, but are still now continuing to pursue a rule. I'd just be curious, how much of your resources are you going to be putting in to develop taking a Fifth Amendment right in the West when it comes to the private property rights of water?
Representative Tipton, you certainly are correct in terms of the litigation, and we understood the court ruling, and we basically pulled that rule, and we started a different process, a more collaborative process. And the directive that we're working on now is not designed to take private property rights at all. It is simply designed to make sure that we continue to have adequate resources for the ski areas that are important and are located in and around our nation's forests.
I appreciate that comment. And for the ski areas, this is a broader issue also for our farm and ranch community. We do have BLM grazing permits, water rights that have been developed there as well. That being said, we keep hearing about this vague rule that you're mentioning about to be able to create some certainty. However, the Loon Mountain ski area in New Hampshire, are you familiar with that?
I'm not familiar with a specific ski area, but
through your department, as a conditional use of permit, they're requiring them through a forced transfer of their water rights. This is after all of our discussions. So what kind of certainty are we really getting in the West when we're told that a rule is being developed and now we have the Loon Mountain Ski Resort in New Hampshire and it's going to require them to sign over their water rights?
Well, I think that there has been a collaborative process. There have been hearings and public input on this directive, and I'm fairly confident, based on the court ruling and based on what our Forest Service folks understand, that this is not going to be about private water rights. It's going to be about just maintaining and making sure that we can continue to have the snow and the water that we need to make sure those businesses do well and that the forests are properly maintained. We have 166 million visitors that come to our nation's forests every year. We obviously want to make sure that they have adequate...
Absolutely, and I know you're well aware. Chief Tidwell gave us testimony in comments that not once has water been sold off by a ski area, not once. So there is no need for a rule, but again, I'll remind you, you need to take a look at this Loon Mountain. This is contradicting what you're saying you're trying to do right now. Let's move on to some of the Forest Service issues. Is it more expensive to fight a fire than to go in and treat an area?
Most of the time I would say that's probably accurate, yes. Okay,
as you're aware, the Forest Service right now, we've made an amendment to the Farm Bill which was accepted under Section 8305 for the leasing of air tankers. Can you give us an update now that the Farm Bill's been law for, 8 weeks? What kind of progress you've made for the leasing of those air tankers?
We have had some additional planes that have been accepted into our force. We are working through an appeal process on one tanker issue, which we have to continue to work through. We obviously attempted to do this in a quick and speedy way. Concerns were raised about it. We're now in the process of deciding what the next steps are. But we have and will have additional aircraft on site this year. We'll have additional aircraft on site next year because of the transfer of Department of Defense and Coast Guard aircraft to the Forest Service.
Great. Appreciate that. And I would like to be able to touch on these climate hubs. How much are you going to spend on the climate hubs? One's in Colorado.
Well, that's already in the budget. It's not a question of additional resources.
I know. How much is that?
Well, I don't know how much
Well, just out of curiosity, we have something called NOAA. Is this a duplicative process?
No, not at all. Not at all. This is really designed to identify, to work with producers and landowners in each region of the country to identify specifically what they're seeing on the ground, to determine what challenges they are confronting relative to production, and develop technologies and strategies and disseminate best practice information to them so that they can adapt and mitigate to whatever climate challenges they're facing, whether it's drought.
None of that's done by NOAA?
No, well, NOAA is about forecasting, and that obviously is part of it, but NOAA is not in the business of telling farmers that if you plant cover crops, you're going to be able to retain additional water, or if you plant a certain type of cover crop, or if you harvest at a certain time, or if you take certain steps relative to livestock, or you use certain forage. They're not in that business. We're in that business. And so this is designed to basically make sure that we are analyzing and assessing the vulnerabilities of agriculture as it relates to climate, and providing our producers with the very best and latest information on how best to mitigate it that's specific to their location as opposed to some general concept.
This is something we'd like to be able to review with you a little bit more, because I think it is duplicative, and our farm and ranch community probably has a pretty good idea in terms of cover crops and being able to deal with it to begin with.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back. Thank you.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Fudge, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. Mr. Secretary, the Healthy Food Financing Initiative in the Farm Bill seeks to provide a model solution for access to fresh food outlets. It builds upon successful initiatives at HHS and Treasury. I'm excited to see this program develop at the national scale at USDA through the authorization of a national fund manager. In Ohio, we have a very successful community development corporation called Burton Bell Car Development that is leveraging an HFFI grant along with partner contributors to serve families in one of our poorest neighborhoods. BBC has developed a number of food access related projects, including Bridgeport Mobile Market, which allows residents of our east side to purchase fresh, wholesome, and nutritious fruits and vegetables from a refrigerated truck. Many of these residents lack reliable transportation to grocery stores. This project, like other HFFI projects, increases access to healthy, affordable foods for families who lack options. At the same time, it fosters economic development and creates full-time jobs. How is USDA planning to support the Healthy Food Financing Initiative, and how might it complement other programs aimed at providing low-income families increased access to healthy food?
Congressman, we've asked in the 2015 budget for resources to be appropriated into the Healthy Financing Initiative. As you know, it's authorized, but there's no appropriated resource. So we have asked for funding. It complements value-added producer grants, farmer market promotion grants, the business and industry set aside for local and regional food systems in a way that provides us opportunities and tools depending upon the community and the circumstance, whether it's a mobile unit would be more appropriate, as is the case with ones we financed in Chicago, or would it be better for us to actually work on a full-scale grocery store as we are in some rural areas. So it provides flexibility. It provides also the ability to partner with the Treasury Department and their new market tax credit system and HHS and their grant program.
Thank you. Several of my colleagues have mentioned over the last few weeks loopholes in the SNAP program that will diminish the effects of the cuts planned for by the Farm Bill. Can you please compare for us the savings in the Farm Bill due to SNAP changes versus the proposed reforms and changes to the commodity program?
Well, I think these savings are all projections. It was projected, I think, $8 billion in terms of the SNAP reforms. And memory serves me correct, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of $13, $14 billion relative to the commodity programs. But the reality is all of those are projections. It may very well be that we save a lot less in commodity, depending upon commodity prices. It may be that we save a lot less in SNAP, because if our pilots are working and people are getting jobs and they're getting better paying jobs, they don't need SNAP. So it's a little bit uncertain at this point. That's why they're called projections. Bottom line, from my perspective, the most important thing we can do in SNAP is to make sure that these pilots that you all have authorized work, and to make sure that we do a better job of working with our state partners to have them do a better job of connecting the jobs they know they have in their economy with the people who are looking for work who are currently receiving SNAP. That's, in my view, the best way to reduce the SNAP rolls.
Thank you. In your testimony, you mentioned that nearly 85% of persistent poverty counties are located in rural areas. While I don't represent a rural district, obviously, I understand the issues at hand because food insecurity and poverty are concerns for my constituents as well. Rural communities face a number of challenges of which my district can identify, including low-wage employment and underemployment, less access to services such as affordable child care and public transportation, and higher food costs. What can USDA do to address the issues of poverty and ease the burden of rural hunger in a more targeted fashion?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, our community facility program is designed to provide and improve schools, hospitals, public facilities, libraries. We have funded over 6,200 projects. Those are also job creators. I think the most important thing to understand about the rural economy is that because agriculture has become extraordinarily efficient and productive, we have actually using fewer and fewer farmers than we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago. What we did not do and what we're now trying to do is to overlay in a complementary economy that will help create other opportunities for folks that are natural resource based. That's why local and regional food systems, which are job creators. It's why ecosystem markets and conservation is a job creator. It's why what you put in the Farm Bill for bioprocessing, manufacturing is a job creator. So if we do a good job of implementing those provisions, we should see increased job opportunities and better paying job opportunities and the capacity to encourage young people that they don't necessarily have to leave. They can stay in the town that they lived in or a town similar to what they lived in.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. Just want a quick question about the catfish program. The 2008 Farm Bill contained a requirement for USDA to provide mandatory inspection for catfish processing, and it has yet to be implemented. There was some clarification of that in the 2014 bill. I understand that expecting that to be finalized by December. Since the complaints that the definition of a catfish in the 2008 bill was too broad, that was all pretty well addressed in the 2014 bill. So I'm just wondering why it would take so long, why it would be December before that's finalized and implemented.
Well, the first step in the process is to make sure that we have a good relationship and understanding about the responsibilities of FDA and USDA. We're completing that MOU that's required. We craft the rule, and now that the broader definition has been confirmed by Congress, which was very, very important because there are varieties and species of catfish that may not have been included but for that language. It allows us now to finalize and put this thing in a process where people can then comment on what we ultimately come up with. It's really the administrative rules process that requires time and requires input, notice, response to what we have. I would anticipate that we will get this done before December. How soon before December depends on how many comments we get, but we're going to work it through the process.
Okay,
it's going to get done.
Thank you. We've talked a little bit about trade. As you know, the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement entirely excluded rice, and I'm worried that that's potentially could set a bad precedent for TPP and TTIP. How's the department working with USTR to make sure that we are providing additional access to rice, additional market access to rice, and can you assure the committee that you'll continue to press that issue?
We are pressing market access very, very hard in our discussions in TPP. It is right now focused primarily on Japan and Canada and specific protections that they have in their rules. We have the most open market of any country in the world. What we want is a high standard agreement, but we also want a fair agreement. So we are continuing to press this, and we have got to see increased market access, or there may not be a deal, or Japan may not be part of a deal.
Thank you. I obviously have concerns about rice, but one of those issues that continues to pop up for the rice industry, but also peanuts. I know that there are some trade barriers to accessing China for U.S. peanut producers, peanut butter as well. Can you speak to that?
Well, we continue to work with our Chinese friends on a variety of issues in agriculture. We have a very aggressive presence over there, multiple offices. I mentioned earlier the China American Business Ag Business Forum that's creating opportunities for us to have additional conversations through informal channels. We have an ag symposium that we have with the Chinese. We had the first one in Des Moines 2 years ago. One is scheduled this year in China. That's an opportunity for us to talk specifically about issues minister to minister. And I'm sure that all of the issues that have been raised and will be raised on China will be raised at that symposium. So there is ongoing conversation. They are our number one customer for a wide variety of agricultural products, and they're one of the principal reasons, obviously, why we've seen record exports. So it's a delicate balance between making sure that markets continue to be open, but also preserving the opportunities that we currently have.
Thank you. And finally, H.R. 933, Continuing Appropriations Act of 2013, was signed over a year ago, had some language in it, Section 742, that required USDA to rescind sections of the original GIPSA rule having to do with the suspension of delivery of birds and with making the rule applicable to live poultry. The department was required to rescind those within 60 days, and it's my understanding that hasn't occurred yet. Can you give me an idea when that's going to be completed?
I'll have to get back to you on that, Congressman. I don't know.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for testifying here today. And as you stated, I mean, the state of the rural economy for many is still very, very difficult. And there is significant hunger in rural America. And in fact, according to USDA data, households in rural areas are more likely to be food insecure or hungry than in urban or suburban areas. And one of the things that really bothered me about the way we considered the Farm Bill in this Congress was that the voices of those who are most desperate, who are most vulnerable, the voices of the poor weren't heard adequately. In fact, I don't believe they were heard at all during the consideration of the Farm Bill. And you know, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway, raised concerns about state waivers. And correct me if I'm wrong, states don't have to take waivers. States request waivers from the administration. Am I right on that?
That's correct.
Yeah. And that's because these governors, of Democrats and Republicans, understand that there are still people struggling in their states. And I should also point out that a majority of those who are able to work, who are on SNAP, work. And the sad reality is that they're working at wages that are so low that they still qualify for this benefit. Maybe we should kind of get serious about increasing the minimum wage so that work in this country actually pays. I think if you work for a living, you ought not to be stuck in poverty. But what really concerns me is what I see as this kind of chipping away at the SNAP benefit. In November, we saw an $11 billion cut to SNAP that resulted that as a result of the recovery monies not being renewed. That resulted in an average decrease of $30 per month for a family of 3 on SNAP dollars. And before that even went into effect, talking to food banks and food pantries and churches and synagogues and mosques all over the country, what's been made clear to me is that the benefit even before that cut wasn't adequate to last a family for an entire month. So people were going to these charities and going to these food banks. And then we had the Farm Bill, which added, in my opinion, to the misery of some of these people with the cuts in the so-called heat need program, and that supposedly resulted in a savings of $8.5 billion from SNAP. I guess maybe we should be thankful that those cuts only targeted a small percentage of poor families. But tell that to a family of 3 that is going to see another $90 cut from their SNAP benefit each month. That means in the heat need states, a family of 3 could see an average of $120 per month cut in their SNAP benefit, which I think is just unconscionable. Now, thankfully, and I want to publicly thank the governors and praise these governors who have taken action for preventing these cuts from taking effect. These are Democrats and Republican governors. This is something that it was clear in the bill that states had to come up with at least $20 worth of LIHEAP money in order to help increase the SNAP benefit for some of these poor families. The states have done that, And Mr. Chairman, I want to, because there's been a lot of complaining by some members of your party about this move, including from the Speaker of the House that I think he called it fraud and abusing the program. This is very much consistent with the law, and in fact, it actually doesn't impact the so-called savings. And I want to put in the record the Majority Committee staff report that says the press reports assume that the change of behavior of these states eliminates the savings estimated from the reforms included in Section 4006. This is false and fails to recognize CBO considerations included in the savings estimate. So it doesn't impact the savings, but I want to praise these governors for not turning their backs on the most desperate people in their communities, which kind of brings me to my question, and that is Congressman Ryan submitted his budget, which includes about $120 billion plus in SNAP cuts. I think that is immoral, quite frankly, what that budget does to this program. I would be interested in your response to Congressman Ryan's proposed cuts in this program and how it would affect people not only in rural America but all across America.
Well, I think it's safe to say, Congressman, that a cut of that magnitude would be devastating to the families that would be impacted. But I think it's also safe to say that an increase in the minimum wage would potentially move people out of the need for SNAP or out of the need for as much SNAP as they're currently getting. I think there's some indication that it could save billions of dollars. But I'm going to deal with the world that I live in and the world that I have today, which is really focusing on trying to find more job opportunities for those folks who are genuinely interested in working. You mentioned the fact that more folks in SNAP are working, and that's absolutely correct. 42% of households receiving SNAP actually have somebody working. I would also point out that nearly double the number of families have either no gross income or no net income. We've seen a much dramatic increase in the number of families that have no income at all that are receiving SNAP. So these people obviously need help, and the concern I would have is that the Ryan budget would do great harm to those families.
Gentleman's time has expired. I would yield myself 10 seconds at the toleration of my colleagues, just simply to note that the actions of the governor and the public discussion no doubt mean that this issue will not go away, and whether it's in approach this year or next year or perhaps in 2017, I have a feeling we'll revisit my friend and my from Massachusetts, myself's favorite subject several more times. With that, the gentleman's time is expired, and I turn to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Dargelais, and recognize him for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary, for being here today. As you know, on the way in, I mentioned that I was going to talk to you about a subject that I think you're aware of regarding the black vulture problem that is plaguing the Southeast. I had received a letter from Representative Mike Sparks from Rutherford County just a couple of days ago. He was getting many calls from his constituents that the vultures were attacking livestock there. Have a letter from the Tennessee Cattlemen's Association, Charles Hord, who was addressing this issue as well as many other constituents from around my district and around Tennessee that have had a problem with this. And I think, as you said, you're aware of it, but let me give you a few details and then maybe what I would like to ask of you in response. The black vultures continue to be an issue with the cattle and sheep producers in Tennessee as well as many other states, and they actually will attack newborn animals by poking out their eyes and then consuming them. They also will attack the backside of cows, causing damage and sometimes death of these. In Tennessee last year, there was estimated about a $4 million loss. And other states such as Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, North Carolina all had similar such problems. And right now, to combat this problem, they're required to go through the U.S. Department of Agriculture Wildlife Services, Blaine Heil, to get permits. For this problem. The permits cost $100. They take about 2 to 4 weeks to get, and they expire on March 31st of the next year. So oftentimes the calving season is over before they're able to get a permit, which allows them to kill up to 10 to 15 of these birds who are protected under the Migratory Bird Act. And they've tried fireworks, shooting in the air. They're a pretty adaptable bird. It scares them away temporarily, but they come back. So what I guess we're asking would be your help in finding a better permitting process. The Tennessee Cattlemen Association would like to recommend that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service begin an online permit process that would permit, so that the permit would be good for a 3-year period, and that would save producers both time and money of applying for the permit each year, and help with the issue of producers having to wait before they can take action against the black vultures. And the Cattlemen's Association also recommends the Department of Interior begin studying why there has been such an increase in black vulture attacks and consider issuing a depredation order that would allow for the reduction of black vulture populations similar to those issued for blackbirds and Canadian geese. So at any rate, and also there's a suggestion, why should there be a $100 fee for this application? Is there anything that you could do to help on this issue, or would you be willing to work with us if we reached out?
Congressman, I'll be happy to convey the concerns that you've expressed about the Interior Department's Fish and Wildlife Service operation of the permitting. The online suggestion is a good one, and that's something that I would certainly convey to Secretary Jewell. I will say that our Wildlife Services portion of APHIS is working with producers to try to give them tips on ways to address this predator issue, providing technical assistance to help them control the problem, as well as assisting them in the filling out of and accessing these permits. We'll obviously continue to do that, but we will certainly convey the concerns that you've expressed here today.
I appreciate your time. Thanks for listening. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair turns to the gentle lady from Washington State for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here and all the work from you and your staff implementing the Farm Bill as quickly as possible. We really appreciate it. I also wanted to take a moment to recognize the efforts of Forest Service employees in Darrington, Washington. As you may know, a massive landslide took place in my district near Oso, Washington, wiping out an entire neighborhood with very heartbreaking and devastating results. As of this morning, at least 30 people are confirmed dead and 15 are still missing. And immediately after the tragedy, Forest Service employees in the area devoted their time and resources as volunteers. They did so without pay and by taking annual leave, and have done everything they can to help. And having spent much of the last week in the area myself, their efforts and the efforts of all the first responders has been truly inspiring, and they should be commended for their work.
Thank you.
We talked a little bit earlier about Farm Service Agency offices, and I know you proposed closing 250, and you said that none would be closed here in 2014. I wondered if you could give us a timeline for when you'll make the decision going forward. We have 3 offices in my district. They're incredibly important to our counties, which have growing agricultural communities, and wanted to know when you might be releasing a proposal.
We're going to we learned a good lesson from the last effort at reducing these offices, that we really did need to do a better job of focusing on where the work is actually being done and making sure that we have adequate staff members commensurate with the workload. So we are in the process now of doing an evaluation of where work is actually being performed so that we can essentially rearrange, if you will, staffing. And then making sure that offices are adequately staffed to provide the help and assistance that folks need. That process we anticipate is going to take a good part of 2014, calendar year 2014. So I don't anticipate making decisions relative to any potential closures until that's completed, and until we have a chance to also look at how it relates to the congressional directive vis-a-vis 20-mile limits. You all have basically designated that we needed to consider how close another office is and so forth, and that there is a process by which we provide notification to Congress and have a series of hearings in any county that's impacted by this. I think it's absolutely essential to reiterate the fact that our salaries and expense line item for the Forest Service, or for the FSA, has been reduced to the point where we have 20% fewer FTEs or full-time employees than we did just several years ago. You cannot absorb all of that reduction without having some impact on on the staffing. And we think it's important to note that there are offices today that literally do not have a single person in them, that they're a location, but they're not staffed. And there are those that are within a few miles of another office that has a number of employees where there's only one employee. So when you take that, when you take into consideration the technology changes that are taking place that's going to change the way in which people react and interact with FSA offices, we think the time is right for us to ask the question, if we were going to produce this system today, would we produce it in exactly the same way that it is today? And I think the answer is no, we wouldn't. We'd make some changes. We'd modernize it. But I want to also emphasize it's not about saving money. This is about taking those resources that would be saved and reinvesting them in modernizing these offices, the remaining offices, and making sure that their responsibilities not only are focused on their programs, but having at least a cross-train opportunity on other programs. So we think this is an improvement. And there may be fewer offices, but we think there'll be much, much better offices.
Thank you. We look forward to seeing your proposal. You also mentioned the SNAP Employment and Training Program. That was based on a very successful program we've had in Washington State. I introduced legislation based on that program, which led to the program that is in the Farm Bill, something I'm proud of and I think is going to be very, very important going forward. Is the timeline on creation of these pilots on target to meet the 180-day window on developing the processes for state to apply for these pilots?
It is. Undersecretary Concanon has actually traveled to a number of states that have had success. I believe he's also been in your state. So it is on track. We've also had conversations with sister agencies, Department of Labor, Veterans Affairs. 7% of folks on SNAP are veterans, so we're deeply concerned about that. And so there's been a series of conversations that are taking place. I'm confident we're going to be on track to get this thing to a point where we'll see some pilots in place certainly at the beginning of next fiscal year. The way the money's allocated, it's $10 million this year and the balance into 2015. So I think the expectation is that most of the actual work will be done in FY15. But we're on target.
Thank you, and I look forward to information as that rolls out, too. Thank you for your time again, and I yield back.
Gentlemen, gentle lady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Gibson, for 5 minutes.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I want to begin by thanking you and the ranking member really for your leadership throughout the process of the Farm Bill. Certainly a challenging environment, and I think the way that you guys worked together was exemplary and something I think the whole Congress can gain inspiration by. And I also want to thank the staff, the entire staff, for all the work that they did in the long couple of years that was the Farm Bill process. Mr. Secretary, thanks for being here today. I'm encouraged by your testimony. I appreciate your remarks with regard many things, but with regard to the beginning farmer program, I do think it's going to make a difference, and it's going to help in my area. It's going to help facilitate a trend that we're already noticing in the marketplace, which is an uptick in the number of young folks hearing the calling of farming. And I think the program is going to be complementary and helpful. Also noted with interest your points on exports being up. I think that's also good for us. Conservation programs. What I'd like to do is I've got several areas I'd like to have you respond to. We'll see how far we go in terms of the timing here. But number one has to do with an initiative that myself, Mr. Courtney, Mr. Welch, Mr. Schrader, and others brought forward for the bill. Had to do with the school lunch program and a pilot that monies for schools that instead of going towards canned goods, commodities, that they could be used for community-supported agriculture, CSAs. I think this will be not only helpful in terms of nutrition, but also could be beneficial in terms of inspiring a new generation to come to the farm. Was wondering where we are in terms of thinking through implementation of that, and certainly my staff looks forward to working with your team on that score.
We've had some involvement with that in a couple of states, and we are excited about that opportunity as well. And one of the things that we are attempting to do is utilize our Farm to School program to make sure the word gets out about those opportunities, as well as just generally the opportunity to buy local and to provide assistance and help to local producers. We currently have 71 projects in 42 states under the Farm to School program as well, impacting hundreds of schools. So we think this is an opportunity, and I think you'll see progress on this for the next school year.
Well, thanks. And we're going to want to be competitive. We'll work with your team on that. And I'm glad you mentioned next school year, because that's the sort of horizon that we're working with, too, hoping to finalize some of the applications by the summer so that with the coming school year that we could be involved in the program. And the second area has to do with broadband. Thanks for your work and for your team's work on this, and very important to rural areas. And was interested in an update in terms of efficacy in the program and service for unserved areas.
Well, we have 225 projects that were a result of the Recovery Act funding. Over 58,000 miles of fiber have been laid. Over 1,100 wireless points have been established, and that's providing help and assistance to 140,000 new subscribers, which includes almost 6,000 businesses and close to 700 anchor institutions like universities and schools, National Guard armories, and things of that nature. Many of these projects are still in the process of being completed, so those numbers will increase. In addition, there have been roughly 400 distance learning and telemedicine activities and grants that we've put forward. And we're working with the FCC because at the end of the day, the real issue here is not so much what we can do, as we obviously have an important role, but the private sector is the one that's obviously got to carry the ball. And so that's why we have asked them to take a look at their most recent ruling relative to the universal service fee, maybe create a little more flexibility in terms of waivers, a little more understanding about the challenges of implementing these changes and still repaying loans that have been taken out in the past based on the old system to expand service, and maybe look at that Connect America Fund and creating a little bit more of an incentive for others to participate.
And I agree with all on that score. Last point, and you may have to respond for the record, we'll see how the time goes, has to do with a public health scourge that we have in the Northeast, and actually I think it's reaching across the country, tick-borne diseases, in particular Lyme disease. And in the Farm Bill, we put some emphasis for research, given changing weather patterns, impact in terms of tick-borne diseases. We've got some experts in the Hudson River Valley. We've been competitive, I think, in the past. And we reach out to you and just look forward to working with you. We think this is another avenue of attack that we can make on this important public health issue.
Congressman, I want to make sure that an announcement we're making today relative to the disbursement of roughly $48 million, which is really focused on better pest and disease management, whether that impacted the specific issue you raised. I'm told it doesn't, but we obviously are very sensitive to these issues, and we'll be happy to work with you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair would like to note to my colleagues that based on the Secretary's hard leave time of 12:15, I have enough time for 14 more members to ask questions. I have 22 members. Therefore, any member has the right to object, but I'm going to ask by unanimous consent that we agree to continue questioning for 4 minutes at a time. Is there any objection to going to 4-minute questioning period for the remainder of the witness's testimony? Any objection? Seeing none, the gentlelady from California is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. This is California-specific question. There have been several of us from the California delegation who have been hearing from the grocery stores in our districts, specifically on the California WIC moratorium for new vendor licenses. Is it on track? Is the subjects to change? What are the factors involved one way or the other? Is the timeline published for the public to see?
We're working on trying to address this issue, Congresswoman. It's a very serious issue in California, and we're working with the California folks to get it resolved. I think we're close. I'm not sure we're totally there yet, but I think we're very close to making sure that we have the controls in place so that the WIC program is not abused as it was being abused by a number of stores.
And we understand that. However, is it possible to provide some level of certainty, at least what time the publishing date as the start date for the review of the applications through a vendor alert? And given the timeline, would you consider adding additional exemption criteria to it?
Well, I think the best thing for me to do is make sure that our folks from Food and Nutrition Service get in touch with you to give you a more detailed briefing. I just know that we're on track, we're working with the state, and we're hopeful of getting this resolved quickly. I'm not quite sure about all the details that you're asking for, so if it's with your permission, perhaps we can get someone to visit with you and your staff precisely about what the circumstances are.
Okay, as you know, whenever there's bad actors, not only do the bad actors get punished, but then everybody else that's in the system also gets punished.
Right, but this was a horrendous thing that was taking place. So.
We understand. So, okay, so that if your department would contact me, and that way we can move on and see where we are with this issue. Thank you so much.
Gentlelady's wonderful and yields back the balance for time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fincher, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Secretary, for being here today. Let me just take just a few minutes to say how much I appreciate the chairman and the ranking member working on the Farm Bill for month after month after month to get this finished and completed for the country. Over the last, I guess, probably 4, 5, 6 weeks, we have done a variety of Farm Bill meetings. My district is the western part of Tennessee, so I border Kentucky, Mississippi, and Missouri, and we did probably 15 Farm Bill meetings in my state and the surrounding states. Probably 2,000 to 3,000 people attended all of these meetings. My background is I'm a farmer, but something that we were running into, Mr. Secretary, is I guess our FSA offices are very concerned because they have been cut. They're understaffed. RMA is concerned about getting all of this information out there to them in a timely fashion. Do you see or do you think we may get into a position in the summer of extending our certification deadlines, later in the year because FSA will not be ready? Can you give me your thoughts on that?
I don't anticipate that that's going to be the case as of today, Congressman. I mean, we're hiring additional staff with the money that's been provided on a temporary basis, and we're working very quickly to get the educational materials and the web-based materials prepared and disseminated. So I don't anticipate and expect that we're going to have an inability to get people educated and put in a position that they can make appropriate elections later in the year.
Okay. Something else, too. In a variety of counties in our area, I did one meeting down in Mississippi, and this is the Delta. I mean, big row crop farmland, commodity farmland. And a lot of these counties do not have directors in the counties. And these are areas where there's a lot of work to be done by FSA. And I told the director, one of the directors I talked to, that I would pass along just how important it is, allowing us to move our stuff to control counties and letting us put everything in one county, maybe the county that we live in, even though we may farm in several different counties, will help, definitely. But these directors are just very concerned. They know the extra money is there, but concerned that they will be able to handle the burden of all of this. But it was a lot of information. I know it's a new program, but I said I would pass that along. And just moving along to not eat up as much time as I can, we work with NRCS very often, and I was with some of my local guys over the past 2 or 3 weeks laying some structures out on some of our land. And it seems that morale is down in our NRCS offices, and these are guys that have been there for years and years who I am friends with, who take pride in their work, pride in what they do for not only the agency but for the farmers. And they just, I'm just passing this along, Mr. Secretary. I know you're at the top, but they just said that, look, it's like they don't care. It's like the administration doesn't care. We're just a number. It's not important anymore of the job that we do and what we're trying to do. And I said, well, look, we do care. It's a big process. All of the changes and all of the different things that have happened over the past 15 or 20 years, it's a very different time. But they just seem to be very frustrated. And these are guys on the ground, guys that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So I'm passing that along. And the last thing, to Mr. Scott's statement a few minutes ago about young farmers and trying to get young farmers into the business. I have 2 sons. They love farming. One's at Mississippi State now getting an ag business degree. But I think we have a deeper problem in the country, and I think we see it in Congress. When we have to spend 3 years trying to pass a farm bill that should be bipartisan, it was bipartisan, but we must make sure that we continue to look at the issues that face our country And there are many of us up here, myself and including other members in this committee, that came here to do things, not just make political statements. And I think our problem is deeper than just trying to get young farmers in. We need, as a body in this city, to do what we can for the farmer all over the country. So with that, Mr. Secretary, I appreciate it, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, may I just 10 seconds? Congressman, on the morale issue, that's obviously something we take very seriously. And in fact, we have instituted a process of focusing on the viewpoint survey that is done for all USDA employees. And we have created a process by which we are working with our various levels of leadership to do a better job of reaching out to people and communicating with people. We're having listening sessions across the country, including in NRCS. So it's something we take very, very seriously. I will tell you that it has been a difficult time to be a federal employee because oftentimes they are criticized publicly in sort of a broad brush approach, which is unfair. We went through sequester. We went through a shutdown. Budgets have been cut. It's not an easy time. However, there's just extraordinary work being done, and we have expressed, and I have expressed on numerous occasions, my admiration for the folks at NRCS as extraordinary problem solvers.
I agree also. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I just want to note your opening comments, the reference to the need for immigration reform in rural America. As far as I'm concerned, that's the elephant in the room. Any event that I go to with the Connecticut Farm Bureau or producers, we had the New England Dairy Council in my district a couple weeks ago, came in all ready to talk about the Farm Bill, obviously a historic year in terms of dairy risk insurance. The conversation pivoted to immigration reform within minutes and demanding to know when we are going to move forward in this Congress in terms of getting that done. And I want you to know that for the folks in that room, the fact that USDA is going to run the H-2A program and the Blue Card program by itself, almost without referencing the details of the how long the year waits are going to be and record checks, et cetera. Just the fact that USDA is going to be the vehicle for running the migrant, that alone was sold the entire room. I mean, the trust factor that people have for USDA, despite all the challenges, which my colleague just mentioned a moment ago, that's what people are really yearning for, and we've got to get this done. I mean, CBO's told us it will cut the deficit, it will grow the economy, but particularly in rural America, it is going to unlock the obstacles for having a viable workforce. I wanted to also raise another issue from Connecticut, which this past year, the Connecticut legislature passed by a margin of 134-3 and 34-1 a GMO labeling bill. And I know you have been in the middle of this debate anytime you step foot in public, and I'm not here to ask you or explore with you your own thoughts or position on it. I'm the eternal optimist. I think on the one hand, transparency is something that is inevitable. That's my own opinion. There's probably more tweets that have already gone on just in this room in the last 2 hours. We live in a world of transparency. What I think is needed, and your department has, I think, begun this process with the AC-21 process, is we just need to get a higher level of understanding and engagement in terms of just, agricultural biology and research, and at some point the whole issue just sort of becomes, it finds an equilibrium in terms of public acceptance or public rejection or public choice regarding this issue. And I was just wondering if you could talk about whether or not the department is going to sort of continue that process of just, being an arbiter for information out there, as this debate is inevitably going to continue.
We are. I would say that one of the great opportunities that America has is to embrace diversity. And by diversity, I mean diversity in its largest context, diversity of size of operations, diversity of production methods, diversity of operators. This is, I think, the future of agriculture, and I think it's a hopeful future. There is obviously a stress in agriculture in terms of this conflict between production systems. Honestly, I think it's unfortunate, because agriculture needs to do a better job of communicating to the broader audience of the Americans the benefits that we get from agriculture, the extraordinary affordability and accessibility of food, the freedom it gives the rest of us to be able to pursue other calls of life, because we are delegated the responsibility of feeding our families to someone else, and they're doing an amazing job. We are very committed to this. We are implementing the recommendations of the AC-21 committee. We are engaging the FDA in conversations about this issue of labeling. The concern, obviously, is that if you label, that you're sending potentially a message of unsafety about these products, unsafe products. That's not the case in my view. It's not the case of the 600 and some scientific reviews I've seen on this issue. GMO is not a safety issue. There is room for everyone, and I think we have to have a more collaborative conversation than a conflicting conversation.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair now turns to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, first I'd like to echo the comments of my colleagues to thank you and your staff for your hard work implementing the Farm Bill. I know it's a huge undertaking, but I appreciate that very much, and thank you for being here with us today so we can talk about some important issues. I would also like to acknowledge a special guest I have here with me today, Ms. Linda Andrews from North Carolina Farm Bureau. Linda and her boss, Mr. Larry Wooden, are valuable assets to our farmers in North Carolina and work very closely with my office, and appreciate her being here today. My question to you, Mr. Secretary, is regarding the Uwharrie Forest, which, as you, I'm sure, are aware, is located primarily in Montgomery County, but also extends into Randolph and Davidson counties in North Carolina in my district. I understand from our folks on the ground that the forest roads have sustained a lot of very serious damage due to heavy rains and flooding over the last few months. In some cases, these roads are completely impassable to our residents, tourists, and first responders. Needless to say, this is a very serious concern of mine, and I want to find a resolution as quickly as possible. I know that quick fixes in Washington sometimes can seem like an oxymoron, but I believe we can find ways to prioritize spending within the Forest Service to accomplish these type tasks. We simply must fix these roads, Mr. Secretary. It's more than a headache for our residents. It's really a safety issue. Having access. Mr. Secretary, could you explain to me briefly how the funding stream works through the forest regions when it comes to road projects like this that may be of an emergency nature?
It is really, we trust the folks on the ground to make decisions about prioritization of resources. I can tell you with reference to this particular forest that gravel is going to be applied soon to the roads that you've mentioned and many of the areas. Public safety is obviously a primary concern. Access for the public and for our Forest Service personnel to maintain the forest is obviously a priority, and that there will likely be grading that's going to be done on those roads at some point in time later in the spring. So there will be an addressing of that specific issue. But Congressman, honestly, the big challenge for us is that in the past, 13% of the Forest Service budget went to fire suppression. Today it's 40%. And the reality is, unless we have a different way of funding forest fires as we do tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, and other natural disasters, we're going to continue to have uncertainty in all other aspects of the maintenance, restoration, and resiliency budgets of the Forest Service. That's why we've proposed a different way of funding fires that would give us greater certainty in those key restoration maintenance budgets, so that we can continue to do a better job of maintaining the services that allow 166 million Americans to visit our nation's forests every single year.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you for that, and I'm committed to working with you on this issue. I know how important it is. My staff's reached out to Chief Tidwell, the Forest Service. We appreciate his cooperation with this. I appreciate your commitment to get that gravel spread out and get those roads active again. On behalf of my constituents, I thank you. And, Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Maloney, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I want to thank you and your staff for working so well with my staff. I really appreciate all your folks have done. I want to say that. One of the things we worked very hard on in the Farm Bill were the crop insurance provisions, and particularly in my part of the world, which is the Hudson Valley of New York, just above New York City, where we have a lot of specialty crop farmers. One of the things that I worked hard to include was the Crop Act, which allows for the better development of specialty crop insurance policies, whole farm insurance, weather-based event insurance. If you could give us an update on that, I'd sure appreciate it.
Sure. One of the things that's occurred in the last couple of years is more policies being written that are connected and directed to specialty crop production. The whole farm policy is one that we are working on. We think that there's an opportunity at some point in time this summer to begin the process of putting one of these together and having the board take a look at it and making sure that it's actuarially sound and that it will work. And so we're expecting and hopeful that we'll have that available for 2015 crop year, potentially on a pilot basis. see how it works, see what we learn from that. Secondly, I think it is important for us to continue to also improve the non-insured crop assistance program. NAPE, and we're in the process of proposing changes and improvements to that as well.
And are you also interested in having RMA do more of its own development of these policies, which it can do now under the new legislation?
Well, I think we will continue to work to use that opportunity. I think these are very sophisticated and complicated actuarial decisions that have to be made. You have to have adequate data to be able to make decisions. So I have trust and faith that they'll make the decision as to when they feel competent and when they need outside assistance and help.
Appreciate that, and if you could keep if you could commit to briefing my staff on that, I'd sure appreciate it, because we worked hard for that as well, so that we can get these policies in action in time to do us some good. You know, the folks in my region are still struggling to recover from Hurricane Irene, which had a terrible effect in Central Orange County, and their losses simply weren't covered by the kinds of insurance they had. So this is an urgent matter, so we don't get another storm. I know you know that, sir. Can I also draw your attention to the special provisions on muck soil? Now, I know it's coming up on reunion time at Hamilton College, and you're probably planning a visit to central New York. And I just point out to you, sir, that on your way, you'll find some of the best agricultural soil anywhere, what we call the muck soil region of New York. If I could get you up there, it'd be great. There is a provision in the Farm Bill that encourages you very strongly to work specifically with muck soil farmers on the special issues they have. It'd be great to show you the region and get your commitment to giving some life to that provision so that we can really give these guys the assistance they need.
I traveled 120 miles to and from law school every day on Route 20. So I am pretty familiar with the landscape of upstate New York, but I always am willing to learn, Congressman.
That's right, and your distinguished record of public service certainly befits someone with a New York education, sir. And the final provision I'd like to draw your attention to is, you know, or at least the issue I'd like to draw your attention to, and I will bring this on time, I promise, is we really benefit from the Hudson Valley Research Lab, which is facing extraordinary cuts from all sorts of sources. And if your department can continue to work to find the funding necessary for the kind of research that goes on there, I don't need to tell you how important it is to the farmers in my region, particularly the specialty crop farmers that really depend on it.
We have taken a look at our entire internal inspection system, our ARS system. We have prioritized the labs that are doing the highest priority work and the labs that are in the best physical shape. We've identified labs that are in difficult shape but doing primary. In other words, we have a capital improvement plan. The challenge for us, obviously, is to find the resources. We're suggesting that perhaps Congress would consider the possibility of allowing us to retain some of the unspent money from year to year to put into a capital account that would help us modernize those ARS facilities. 800 different projects right now. In the last 5 years, 218 patents have been approved. This is an innovative center that we obviously want to continue to.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thanks,
the chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Dr. Yoho, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary and Mr. Chairman. I want to just also reiterate a heartfelt thank you for the work you guys have done, not only with the Department of Agriculture, but with the committee here. It's just been a great feeling to be a part of that, to get this bill passed. And I also want to thank you, as somebody else did, about the tobacco farmers of Florida in honoring the buyout program. We thank you for that, because we had gotten a lot of calls about that. And I want to talk to you about the citrus industry, and you know well that Florida is #1 in citrus, and you know our plight down there with the greening. You know, the citrus industry accounts for about $1.4 billion in sales, approximately $8.9 billion economic impact. And with the citrus greening going on, 80 to 90% of the citrus trees are affected. And of course, Florida without citrus is like peanut without butter. They kind of go hand in hand. We need that together. And so I was real happy, and I know the citrus producers are real happy in our area to see the money that was put into that. And I commend the committee and you, and I hope that gets allocated as quickly as we can so that we can bring this under control. And if there's anything that we can do to help you with that, please let us know. We're looking for an anxious resolve of that.
Congressman, we put together a multi-agency approach to this, which is involving local, state, and federal folks to have a coordinated response to this. We funded it initially with $1 million, and then $20 million this year, and then $125 that you've put into the Farm Bill will be allocated. We think there are opportunities for us to deal with the vector issue with this tiny wasp. There's an opportunity for us to look at the pH content of the land surrounding trees that might be a opportunity, and thermal, using heat on the top of these trees may work. We're going to continue to fund those projects, look at additional suggestions, and then make sure we fund the ones that are working the best and ramping them up.
I appreciate that, and I know they do too. And I want to talk to you about the peanut program. The crop insurance industry has introduced the revenue crop insurance program, but yet it hasn't been, approved for the peanut program, and we're hoping that we can get that implemented just as quick as we can. Are you familiar with that?
I am familiar with it. I believe that it's the
revenue crop insurance program.
Right. It's a policy that would require board approval, and if the board approves it, we'll obviously move forward with it.
And you brought up that China was a big importer of our peanuts. Is that because the South American market took a hit on peanut production, and so for the last 2 years they've been buying more of our peanuts? And if so, do you see that continuing?
I'd like to say it's because we have a better product at a better price.
I would like to think that too. My concern is with due to the incentives and some of the language, especially with the reference price of $5.35, that we're seeing an increase in peanut production already nationwide by 29%, 53% in Georgia, 35% in Mississippi, and 7% in Florida. With this large increase in production, I can't help but think it's going to drive the price of the peanut down, and it could affect a lot of the things that we talked about here today, one of them being the young farmers. These guys have just gone into the business in the last 5 to 10 years. These are the very people that we're trying to help, and if there's an oversupply of the product and the price drops, it could be devastating to that whole market, the very market that we're trying to preserve. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that's obviously a challenge. I think some of the changes in the Farm Bill relative to eliminating the term limit on guaranteed loans might provide some assistance. If somebody's been finding it difficult, they have to refinance their loan at a time when they're term limited coming back to FSA. Now they won't have to worry about that. That may be of some benefit. And we're obviously going to work with producers with forbearance and trying to make sure that we give them every opportunity to succeed.
My time's expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. I turn to the gentleman from Minnesota next for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for coming in late, but thank you, Secretary Vilsack, for your testimony here today. Who was next?
Lady may continue.
No.
One of my dear friends needs to use their 4 minutes.
And Secretary Vilsack, welcome. I had the good fortune to be in Mount Pleasant the day you announced your candidacy for the presidency of the United States. And having been in politics for, the better part of 50 years, it was the purest, best, most wholesome outpouring of community support for one of their favorite sons that I've ever witnessed in politics. The memories
short-lived.
are still vivid in my memory. I trust they are yours as well. A couple of quick questions here. And if they've been asked, I had to step out for another meeting. Did anybody ask about the sugar program and the lawsuits that have been recently brought? And they've been hurting badly. And I know a number of us, myself included, were hoping that you would be supportive of the American sugar producers in the suit that they brought to the International Trade Commission.
I got to be candid with you, Representative. From my perspective, it's a bit ill-timed. I'm not suggesting there isn't an issue. There is, and I think the Mexicans have identified the willingness to work on this by redirecting 700,000 tons of sugar that they would have put into the United States into an export opportunity elsewhere. We are at a very delicate circumstance and situation with Mexico on a variety of issues. and I'm sure that they don't see this as a particularly friendly gesture. So in a perfect world, I would have liked to have seen this perhaps not occur or not occur at this time. But I recognize
thank you for your thoughts on that. And I think they would like not to have had this occur at this time, but I think the circumstances were such they felt that they didn't have any alternatives. So please continue to take a good hard look at that. They need our help. The PILT program, payment in lieu of taxes, we had that attached to the Farm Bill. Did anybody ask about that at all?
No, sir.
Okay, could you share with us your thoughts on that?
Well, we're obviously going to follow the direction of Congress. I think the challenge for us is to come up with a long-term strategy to work with state and local folks to make sure that over time, if Congress makes a decision not to continue to re-up this on an annual basis or provide long-term certainty, that there is a replacement economy. It's one of the reasons why we have been working really hard to try to address new wood opportunities. We recently had a conference at the USDA where we created a prize to look at using wood not just as a framing opportunity in construction, but as structural members in construction. Europeans are now doing this. There are now multi-story buildings being built out of a new cross-laminated timber. We think it's a new opportunity. Wood to energy, new opportunity. So we're trying to figure out ways in which we can stimulate. We're treating more wood as we promised we would, but we need to do more.
Is that part of your biofuels?
It's part of its biofuels, but it's also new products, bioproducts. So you can take wood nanotechnology, you can take wood fibers, and you can make optical materials that can be used in computers and other sensitive technology. You can use it to create new armor for police and fire. There's a whole new opportunity here to use bio-based products, which is what this Farm Bill that you all worked so hard on and passed. It's going to provide us that opportunity to bring those kinds of industries to small towns, which may, over time, allow you to navigate away from the payment in lieu of taxes and obscure rural schools issues.
Good. Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I mean, it was so apparent that the people who knew you best in Mount Pleasant had great faith and trust in you, and you raised a lot of important issues in that campaign. I want you to know that there are a lot of people here in Washington, all over the country, that have an equal amount of faith and trust in you, and we thank you for the great job that you're doing there. Keep up the good work.
With that, the gentleman's time has expired. I turn to the gentleman from Georgia, Austin Scott, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll try to be brief. Secretary Vilsack, the time frame for the USDA's review of biotech products has improved, still beyond the 180 days. What do you attribute these delays to, and what can we do as members of Congress to help remove these impediments? Does it take legislation, and would you support that legislation?
Congressman, we've cut quite a bit of time off the regulatory process, and I think there's more. Part of the challenge is that we're using a new system, but we're still having to work with some of the holdover that we had from the previous administration, working through that under the old system. But as this new system is fully embraced, I think you're going to see significant time reductions. Again, above what's already been done. We've knocked off at least a year.
Sure.
But you can't prevent people from questioning whether or not we've done the right assessment, whether we've done the right environmental review, and that's oftentimes what slows the process down. We're trying to short-circuit this without sacrificing the quality of the inspection and making sure we're doing our job to assess whether there's a pest risk or not.
Okay, so you, and I agree, it has moved in the right direction significantly, but you don't believe that it needs additional legislation to help?
I'm not sure how you would craft it. I'd be open to any suggestions that you have, but I think you would find it difficult to craft it in a way that would get a majority of the House and Senate.
Well,
of course, that may be true.
Motherhood and apple pie might be just as difficult these days.
That's true.
But reducing those delays just helps the rural community so much, and the agriculture is the foundation of our economy, and these new products are extremely important to us. They're extremely important to the nation and the world with regard to food supply. So thank you for your service. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back, and I'm proud of him. And continuing down the list, I turn to the very patient gentleman from Texas for his 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, when I took office in January of last year, one of the first things that I heard about was an issue with cattle crossing in Presidio, which at one time was the #1 port. And, you know, as I worked with your office, I've had several conversations with your Undersecretary, Mr. Avalos. I've had conversations with the Administrator, Mr. Shea of APHIS. And all I've asked is, tell me why you've closed that inspection station over on the Mexican side. Ojinaga, which is the city on the Mexican side, doesn't have any travel advisories. I worked with the State Department, who tell me that it's all clear. Having been a former prosecutor out there, I went with the law enforcement community, both federal and state, who tells me that there is not a problem. And yet, when I deal with the USDA, I'm told we're having a meeting and we'll call you next week, and we're having a meeting and we'll call you next week, and I never get a return phone call. And so, with all due respect, I'm getting the impression that there's some national security, and I'm happy to, reserve a secure room so that we can have a conversation about what is going on over at USDA, because I'm, in all honesty, pretty frustrated that I can't even get an answer. And if it's unsafe, I want to know that. I'd like to know why. It would seem that the State Department and all your sister agencies would disagree with your assessment of the situation on the ground.
Congressman, first of all, to the extent that you're not getting return phone calls, I sincerely apologize. That is not the way we should be doing business with you or any other member of Congress. And we will make sure that doesn't happen, and I apologize for that. Secondly, you are entitled and should have an answer directly to the question that you're raising. It's my understanding that our folks do have a disagreement with the State Department as it relates to the ability of our folks to travel through a section of town to get to that facility that they believe, our folks believe, raises a serious security threat to our personnel, which is why we established on the other side of the border, an inspection process. And I think that is the fundamental issue. And I have asked our team to sit down with the State Department and see whether or not they're right and we're wrong, or we're right and they're wrong, so that there's a consistent message provided to you. I can understand that it's frustrating, especially when one department says one thing, another department says something differently. All I can do is trust, in terms of what I do, I'm obviously first and foremost concerned about the public safety of our employees. If they have concerns, then I have to take them seriously. But they have to be justified and they have to be reasonable.
And I will tell you, I certainly don't disagree with that. My frustration is that you would think that you'd be able to get an answer within, I'm more than halfway through. This is like nearly 18 months into my term. And it was one of the first conversations that I had with your agency, and it would seem that 18 months would be, more than sufficient time to meet with your sister agencies and have an answer. Because when you open temporary facilities, it's not unusual to have a temporary facility at some of the ports of entry, but in Laredo, for example, or in different places, Eagle Pass, they're closed and they're opened a couple of months later. This situation has been this way for over 2 years, and there doesn't seem to be any incentive on the part of the agency to move it off center. And I'd like to invite you, frankly, to come to Presidio, and I'd like to invite you to help me move this issue off of dead center. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time, and the Secretary's word is good, and he will get you an answer, I'm confident. With that, the Chair turns to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, to you and your staff for your work and collaboration putting this farm bill together. Look forward to working with you as we serve our oversight function as you work for implementation. Just a couple of things to touch on. Obviously, the bill contained language to ensure the bio-based market programs inclusive of forest products. And just wanted to check on the status of that and how will we be promoting those changes so that there's broad inclusion of forest products.
We are moving forward on those changes and excited about the opportunity. And we have the lead responsibility, as you know, Congressman, so we're going to make sure our sister agencies are fully aware. The first step in the process for us is to change the regulation, which we're in the process of doing, then notifying our sister agencies, and then we have established recently some kind of reporting system where we can actually look at contracts that are being issued by federal agencies to make sure that they've got the bio-based, bio-preferred language in the contract. Then from that point, once we get everyone pretty disciplined to do that, then it's basically how much are you actually purchasing that's bio-based of all types. And we have, as you know, thousands of products that are in that category and in that program. So we are moving on that issue. We know it's important to you.
Right, and I appreciate it. I think it's important to our healthy forest too, as you know, and you were very encouraging during our hearings when we talked about this in the past, and I appreciate your support for what we did. And I think we have probably one of the strongest forestry titles maybe ever with the Farm Bill. Wanted to touch on base, as I always do, whether it's with you or the forest supervisor at the Allegheny National Forest. So my first question is always timber harvesting. Is timber harvesting make sure that we have healthy forests, but also healthy rural communities. And we did make some changes in the Farm Bill, but I wanted to see any estimates on how many board feet we anticipate producing from the National Forest this year in terms of which ways it's going and what can we do to increase that level of harvest, which again, I think you would agree when we're at sustainable rate of harvest, we've got healthy forests and we have healthy rural communities.
We would anticipate somewhere, I want to make sure I answer your question correctly. I think our goal this year, in this fiscal year, is 2.8 billion board feet, which would be more than last year and more than the year before that. Our goal for FY15 is 3.1 billion board feet, and I get reports on this every month. So I can tell you that it's obviously early in the process, but we've already treated 300 million plus board feet, and I think we're on our way to making sure we meet those goals. I would also say that I think this wood conference that we recently had may spur additional opportunities for us. This cross-laminated timber, I think, has a tremendous opportunity for us, and I hope folks take advantage of the challenge we put forward on that issue.
I think that is very exciting, actually. You've got to increase the markets. Obviously, that's a big part of it, not the only part. And I appreciate what you're doing and pushing out to architects and engineers to educate them on the opportunities. We seem like we're behind. I've got some schools, as others who have National Forest do, who haven't really received their Secure Rural Schools payments yet. For whatever reason, we're a bit behind. Didn't know if you had any kind of update on the status of that.
Those payments, I'm pretty sure that Title 1 and 3 payments went out, Congressman, earlier in March, and I believe the Title 2 payments are going out tomorrow.
Okay. So tomorrow, that's a pretty quick turnaround then. Thank you. We'll take credit from the hearing when I talk to them.
Absolutely. I expect the press release to say nothing less.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair enthusiastically turns to the good lady from New Hampshire for her 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I just want to commend my colleague across the aisle for the incredibly swift results that he was able to get out of that last question. Very impressive. Thank you, Chairman Vilsack, for your leadership. Just to join my colleague, Mr. Nolan, in his effusive praise, I met you the first time when you came to New Hampshire for the first in the nation presidential primary. So my main goal is to invite you to come back. And I just wanted to say it's been a tremendous honor for me to be a part of this committee, the first member in 70 years from New Hampshire. But I have some great news to report to you and to share with my colleagues. Under USDA's most recent census of agriculture, New Hampshire has grown by about 5% over the past 5 years with regard to the number of young farmers and new farmers joining our communities. So our agricultural sector may not be the size of the Midwest, but we certainly are making up for it in terms of our enthusiasm. Robust local food networks, an emphasis on a healthy connection between fresh food and our lifestyle, as well as farmers markets and organics and growing in every way. I also had an excellent meeting this morning with a group of foresters, and I want to join my colleague in terms of encouraging the use of our national forest lands One of the issues that came up this morning had to do with and this may be a local preference, but the foresters are not allowed to forest on Saturdays and holidays. And we're coming up in New Hampshire in a very special 5th season that we have that's called mud season, when the frost goes out and our foresters are not able to work for about 6 weeks. So every day during the winter is actually very precious, and during the summer when the roads dry out, it's very precious. So I just ask you to take that back on advisement, and we'll follow up with the staff. But we'd love to get you to New Hampshire, and tourism and agriculture are our top 2 industries, and so our working landscape is extremely important, and thank you for your leadership. I don't know if you had any comment on that.
Well, I look forward to going back to New Hampshire. It's a great state. It's a beautiful state.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your patience.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you. I just want to point out, I sent a letter to your office on March 6th inviting you to come into my district in central and southwestern Illinois to discuss the issue I'm going to bring up today, which has to do with the school nutrition programs. I would love for you to come out and visit some of our school professionals and hear directly from them about the impacts of the implementation of the 2010 Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. I think we all share the common goal. We want kids to eat healthier. We want to address childhood obesity. But the good intentions have led to some challenges in our school districts, and I've heard from many of our local school districts about how they've once taken profitable parts of their school district portfolio, and because of the new rules and regulations and the lack of participation, school districts like in Monticello, Illinois have now lost $100,000 a year and recently decided to pull out of the school nutrition program, which I don't think is a goal of any of ours. The School Nutrition Association actually said that there are 1.2 million fewer kids that participate in the school nutrition program since the enactment of the 2010 Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. And we're seeing up to 70% of the fruits and vegetables that are being served being thrown away, which is costing school districts hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I just read an article, I thought it was an April Fool's Day article because it was April 1st, but it was from the Los Angeles Times talking about their second largest school district in the nation in Los Angeles that is losing upwards of $18 million a year because of food waste. And that's only at a 10% estimate. And if you add the 60% to that, that's $28.8, almost $29 million a year that it's costing that one school district. This is why I've written to ask for some flexibility, and I just want to make sure that you saw the language in the omnibus spending bill, and it directs the USDA to come up with some waivers for schools that are having a hard time complying to the new rules and regulations. Los Angeles being one, but Monticello in my school district, Hillsborough, Illinois, Calhoun County, Illinois. And I want to give you some credit, too. When we identified some problems with the protein and grain requirements, your agency did offer some flexibility. Thank you for that, and thank you to my colleague, Christy Nome, for making that issue a priority also. But I want to know, have you developed any procedures for the omnibus language for the school districts to ask for flexibility?
Congressman, my staff, Todd Babbitt, handed me the copy of the Richard P. Russell National School Lunch Act, which talks about our authority, and I'll be happy to give this to you. It's fairly clear from this that we don't have the authority that you would like us to exercise. Statutorily, we simply do not have the capacity to waive, and I'll read from it. The Secretary may not grant a waiver under this subsection that increases federal costs or that relates to A, the nutritional content of meals served, or J, the sale of competitive foods. So if you're looking at waiver authority, this is something that you may want to take a look at. And
so basically the omnibus spending language that we put forth, you can't offer those waivers?
That's correct.
Okay. I have a problem. Who then is going to be able to offer the waivers that we've asked to be?
Well, you'd have to change the law to give me the permission and the capacity to do this. I don't have the power to do it.
We did change the law in the omnibus spending bill.
You directed us to grant waivers. You didn't give us the authority to do so.
I'd like to point out that this administration doesn't have a problem changing and offering decisions on other legislation, but that's a different subject.
Yeah.
I just would ask you to come visit so that we can get your support and the support of this administration to offer some flexibility to these school districts that they obviously need.
Congressman, may I, Mr.
Gentleman may respond.
Very quickly. First of all, 92% of school districts in this country have either already been certified or in the process of receiving certification under these new standards. So there has been acceptance. I'm not sure that the School Nutrition Association is absolutely correct as it relates to the people that aren't participating, because we've seen a dramatic increase in the school breakfast program. So I wonder about those numbers. And on the issue of food waste, I think we have to be very careful about this issue, and here's why. 30% of all food that's produced in the United States of America is wasted. 30%. It happens in restaurants, it happens in homes, it happens in schools, it happens everywhere. And that's an unfortunate circumstance, and it's something, frankly, I'd be happy to work with you on, trying to figure out how to reduce food waste, because it's not only a terrible waste of production, but it also is the single largest part of solid waste in our landfills, and it's a methane producer. So there are many reasons to get focused on that issue.
I would love to work with you on that issue. I would love to work with you on addressing some of the concerns I brought up, but I don't want you to confuse the 85 to 90% compliance rate with satisfaction from the school districts, and I'd appreciate your ability to work with me on addressing some of those concerns too, sir. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Vilsack, you recently visited my home state, New Mexico, and my district, and I really appreciate that, and thank you for your efforts to be present and on the ground. And I'd like to follow up on an issue that we briefly spoke about, because we have such a high proportion of minority farmers and ranchers in New Mexico. And in June of last year, the Forest Service conducted a civil rights compliance review that included Region 3 in New Mexico and found that they were non-compliant with several civil rights requirements. Now, the report detailing these findings and suggested corrective actions to be taken directs the Forest Service to develop a detailed corrective action report, I think within 60 days of the receipt of the report. It states that the plan must also include any progress made in these areas since the review. Can you provide me with any updated information related to both the corrective action plan and progress to date on implementing and going through those review processes?
Congresswoman, I'd be happy to have our team and our staff provide you with details. So if you don't mind, I'm going to answer your question a bit more generically and generally. I receive a monthly report relating to EEO complaints and program complaints for each department of USDA. I can tell you that both are at record lows, which is good in terms of the overall department. When we see high numbers of program complaints or EEOC complaints, we ask our civil rights folks to look into it and to create a collaborative effort with the mission area to work out difficulties. I know that Joe Leonard in our Civil Rights Office has been working very closely with the Forest Service. I know Region 5 has been an area that he's spent a lot of time on, but honestly, at this point in time, I'll have to check on Region 3 in terms of precisely what's happened there, but I'd be surprised if we aren't on top of this.
And Mr. Chairman, if I might, and just to respond to that with the Secretary, you were responsive to me when you were in the district. You offered staff to come back out on the ground. That has not yet come to fruition, and so continuing your efforts on our behalf, I would be very grateful. Make sure that we do have the department engaged to the highest degree possible, and do appreciate that you spend time on corrective action plans and reviewing how the department is doing in a variety of levels. And I think that that's an encouraging effort that many more departments and the administration should be doing. So I look forward to having you back in the district, and we're ready to work with you. We are more than ready to work with you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. We have the gentleman from Louisiana, the gentleman from California, and the gentlelady from South Dakota remaining, and there is time. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. McAllister, is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, sir. It's tough being the low man on the totem pole, waiting until the end, but first I just want to tell you thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary. I appreciate the bipartisan support. You know, I represent one of the largest, or the largest row crop district in the state. So when this farm bill came about, now obviously I'm the new kid on the block, and I ain't never held no public office. So I went to the people and I asked them about the farm bill, and over 253 different constituents from every part of the industry that I asked, not a single one of them said no. They all said, please make sure this farm bill passes. Please get it in. So
I like your constituents, sir.
So I just want to commend you, Mr. Chairman, and you, Secretary, for that. And heck, I'd definitely appreciate it if you want to come down to my district and check out these guys. And remember, crawfish goes out about May, so if you want to come, now's the time to come. If you want to eat good and enjoy some corn and potatoes and crawfish. But one concern I have, and I was just in the district this past week, and look, I know we have to live in the reality of the world that we live in, and I know some certain things need to be changed on, but the FSA program is one of them. There's is a serious concern to me with the rural farmers and all that we have in the rural communities. And my main concern is most of these farmers, and we live in a technologically challenged area for us. One with the internet capabilities, and even some of these older farmers. And I heard the other gentleman talking earlier about trying to get younger age farmers into the program, which absolutely we need to. But that one-on-one and filling out those applications and what the FSA program does for my district is very vital. So the only thing I just, and it's really not a question per se to put you on point or ask, is just please be mindful when it comes to how we do try to regroup and restructure this, that we make sure that Mr. Bud down the road that don't turn on a computer and the only thing he has is to set that appointment and go meet with his FSA officer is still being represented and still gets his programs and get them done. And I'm all about efficiency and whatever we can do to help. But I really, being one of the largest row crop districts in the country, I do sincerely wish that if you get the opportunity to come down and visit, and we'll get all the farmers together and we'll send you back with loads of peaches and sweet potatoes and everything else that we are growing. But I think it would mean a lot to them to know that they feel like they're kind of being disenfranchised with this FSA, because all they hear is the media and the hype, and people want to point the finger at you and say that you're cutting because you're doing other things in the budget. But it's the world we live in, and how we have to be more efficient about what we do and how we do it. At the end of the day, I think we're all on the same page that we want to support the farmer and make sure that we're still producing enough crop to feed this country and export as much as we can to be sustainable. So whatever your comments might be on that, but I definitely appreciate your time coming here today and visiting with us.
Well, Representative, I think the reason why we learned from the previous experience of taking a look at where the work is required will take into consideration those areas that are technologically isolated, so that it makes it more difficult for folks to take advantage of whatever technology advantages and advances are being made in service. So that is something we definitely should take into consideration, and we will take into consideration. This is not about denying people the help they need. This is about ensuring that we give them not just the help they need, but even working to maybe give them some ideas that they never even thought about, to be able to connect farmers to rural development programs, to conservation programs more effectively, and to deal with the budget realities that we face. So we will be sensitive to the concerns you've expressed here.
Well, I appreciate it, and I look forward to working with you. I yield back my...
Gentleman yield back the balance of his time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. 4 minutes, I'll hurry. Appreciate earlier commentary. California, I'm from there, big drought. Anything you can do to help expedite the disaster assistance, and especially as it affects the livestock indemnity program, we stand to help you assist with that as well. We have issues going on also we're talking about the 404 permits and such, and we have people running into problems with EPA and those folks, and doing crop changes, and that somehow it invokes some kind of Clean Water Act problem, that when they're merely changing crops and getting in trouble with the federal government about that. So we might come to you with seeking some assistance on getting through that, because we think that's a wrong interpretation, as was commented earlier. Thank you again for Ms. Negretti McLeod mentioned on the WIC program. California, we need to see how we can lift that moratorium, get more vendors out there being able to compete, provide more choices, and hopefully better pricing for people in the WIC program. To reiterate, do you know when there might be a start date for reviewing the applications
I don't know the specific date, but I know that there has been a real focus on trying to get this done and getting it resolved quickly. This was a major problem, and we've been working with the state for a long time. So with the questions that are being asked here, I'm more than happy to get back to my office and make sure that Kevin Kincannon and his team get in touch with your office and some of the other folks who have asked this question to make sure that we get you the latest information.
Thanks so much. Jumping to forestry, I mean, in California, the whole saying, you can't see the forest through the trees. We've got too dang many trees. So we need to get a lot more yield out of our forests. One of our units up there in the Northeast was, they had as an original goal 32 million board feet. I hear now they're only going to come with 12 million board feet in this year. So a couple of my colleagues did mention board feet and yield and all that, and we need a lot more help. We need a lot more help on the salvage side of it too, where we have frustrated vendors out there, foresters that would like to get at that after salvage. We're getting some movement on the rimfire, but a lot of others are very, very frustrating because, as you know, you got a short amount of time to get at the salvage timber before it becomes insect infested, and then instead of a positive to the economy and a positive getting it out of the forest, now becomes a cost to whoever's going to have to remove it later, or you have a tinderbox. So some local constituents visited just my office this morning and spoke with some Forest Service folks, and what they're getting is that that's kind of a circular argument. Like they say, well, the local folks have the authorization to push forward on salvage and on the amount of board feet. You talk to them, they say, well, it's coming from Washington, D.C. So we could really use your help on clarifying who has the authorization to push forward on, is it just salvage or in general getting these permits out. The frustration is that the harvest permits are not moving quickly enough, and they actually are part of the solution to funding. You hear about funding. There's not enough staff to get the harvest plans or other forest activities done. We would have a positive income if we're getting those out timely and getting the forest working again. So I throw all these things out as could you help us clarify a little bit later too on where the authorization really lies to make the decisions on the forest units? Is it in California, in Vallejo, or is it in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I know that in D.C. we basically set a goal, and I track it, as I indicated earlier, I track it on a monthly basis. I'm under the assumption that these decisions are not made in D.C. They're in terms of specifics, they're made at a much more local level, but I want to verify that and make sure that I'm giving you correct information.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from South Dakota for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you for making livestock disaster programs a priority and getting those implemented. You know what South Dakota's kind of gone through the last couple of years with the drought in 2012, the devastating blizzard we had in October of last year, and the tens of thousands of cattle that we lost. We now are western South Dakota's gone through another 2-day blizzard here in the middle of calving season, and it's hitting eastern South Dakota today. So it's been rough, and the fact that you've made it a priority means a lot to the producers at home. It means a lot to me. I know sign-up starts April 15th. How soon do you think some payments might reach the individuals?
I've been told that our goal is to do it relatively quickly. I don't want to pin myself down or our team down to a specific timeline, but I can tell you everybody understands that these folks have waited far too long for help, and everyone understands that every day that goes by that they don't get help, somebody who's on the bubble may get out of the business.
Typically in the past, it's taken how long for the payments to go out?
I don't anticipate it's going to take very long.
Okay.
Folks have been assuring me that they are prepared to get this money out as quickly as they possibly can. That's the hope, and that's the goal.
I've got another problem, and as far as when it comes to FSA closures, in the past, what we've seen in South Dakota is that an FSA office will be listed for closure where the NRCS office that's right in the same building located next to it is not. And, a lot of the producers recognize the FSA office has a big workload, and they're wondering why that is focused on rather than NRCS when they're co-located, and that obviously we'd like to have. I believe you talked about this earlier before I came in the room of wanting to have a one-stop shop that could meet all the producers' needs, but I think that's priority. 2 things I'd like you to focus on when you look at producing where those potential closures might come is the workload, which you've indicated you would. The other one is distance, because I believe in law it says that each office cannot be more than 20 miles apart as the you drive on the road miles. In South Dakota, some of those that were listed and have been closed were 50, 60, 70 miles apart. And when we called USDA and visited with FSA about it, they were interpreting it as the crow flies. I don't believe law says that. I believe that law says driving miles, and I hope that that's followed when you look at this list and trying to become more efficient and better serving the producers. Another thing in northeastern South Dakota, when it comes to NRCS, we've got some specific issues in some counties where producers who are trying to get wetland determinations done feel like they're being treated unfairly. And honestly, they tell me they feel like they're being prosecuted. So I need some help with that. I think that when you have land in one county that's adjacent to another county, and the land in this county is treated completely different, and the wetland determinations are happening in a timely manner, whether it's yes, no, whatever they like is favorable, doesn't matter, but it's timely and it happens, and the county right next to it is taking a year, 2 years, sitting on the wetland determinations, it is extremely frustrated for those producers to make decisions. So I don't think it's a whole South Dakota problem. I do think it is a northeastern South Dakota problem.
And we have attempted to change the method in which these determinations are made to raise it up a level so that we don't have quite the disparity that you've mentioned. Hopefully that will mitigate that uncertainty.
I might need your help with that. If we can focus on northeastern South Dakota and make sure that that district within NRCS is complying with the direction that you've given to them, that would be great. The last thing is Section 8204 of the Farm Bill that looks at Forest Service land and some of the new authorities that we've given them and how to deal with Forest Service land when in regards to invasive species. We have the pine beetles going on in the Black Hills. And I know that you would probably agree that this is an important provision. Chief Tidwell has told us that he thinks it's an important provision. And it requires the government of a state to make a declaration to you to ask to use these authorities so that treatment areas can be detected. I know that my governor has done that. Have other governors asked for that authority and that provision?
They have. We had a meeting with the Western governors, and they all expressed a desire to participate in this, and we encourage them to get to us their designation so that we can determine whether or not it is expansive enough or significant enough. You're correct. The Forest Service is anxious to use this authority to streamline the process and hopefully to get a better handle on some of the problems that we're confronting.
Super. Thank you so much. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. All time for questions is expired. The chair now turns to the ranking member before we adjourn to make any closing remarks that he might choose to.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank the Secretary for his patience and his willingness to answer questions. And I guess there's some questions that need to be answered in writing, so we look forward to that. But just look forward to working with the Secretary and his people, getting this bill implemented and getting the information out to the farmers on a timely basis, as timely as we can. So thank you for being here. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair wishes to note also the Secretary's appreciation for the 2 hours and 45 minutes here, and would note that we are about to adjourn in a timely fashion. After 2.5 years of Farm Bill, I like doing things in a timely fashion indeed. With that,
Mr. Chairman, if I could just let me close by a number of your colleagues have indicated the extraordinary work that you and Congressman Peterson individually did on the passage of the Farm Bill. I'd like to associate myself with those remarks as well, to acknowledge the great work that was done by both of you to get this Farm Bill through, and certainly appreciate the bipartisan nature of the work that this committee is engaged in. It's an example not just for this committee, but it's an example hopefully for the rest of the Congress and the country.
thank you, Mr. Secretary. Under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplemental written responses from the witnesses to any question posed by a member. This hearing of the Committee on Agriculture is adjourned.